Please, don't tell anyone. He's my grandson. He's the only family I have left. Marcus Walker had seen a lot in 30 years on the road. Bar fights, funerals, brothers bleeding out on asphalt. But nothing had ever made his hands shake the way they shook the moment he lifted that sleeve. What he saw wasn't an accident. What he saw was a message, sent again and again, pressed into an old man's skin by someone who was supposed to love him. If this story hits something in your chest, subscribe to this channel right now and follow every part until the end. Drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The annual Veterans Memorial Ride didn't start the way it usually did. Every year for the past 11 years, the moment Marcus Stone Walker throttled up his bike and pulled out of the staging area, something shifted in the air. 395 Hells Angels weathered men and women who had buried friends, survived wars of their own, and earned every scar on their bodies would fall into formation behind him like a river finding its natural course. The sound alone was enough to rattle windows a quarter-mile away. The ground vibrated, birds scattered, and for a few hours each August, the desert highway outside Flagstaff, Arizona became something close to sacred. But this year, Marcus barely made it out of the parking lot before he stopped. I didn't know why at first. He was already rolling, already feeling the familiar pull of open road, already half lost in the particular silence that only existed inside the roar of an engine. And then something caught his eye. Off to the left, past the row of portable water stations and the folding tables covered in veterans' memorial patches, past the edge of the pavement where the asphalt crumbled into hard red dirt, there was a man sitting alone beside the burned-out shell of what used to be a storage shed. Marcus cut his engine. The man was old, not just elderly ancient in the way that people become when life has worked on them like weather works on stone. He was sitting in a folding lawn chair that had clearly been there for a long time. Its webbing faded from whatever color it had once been into a kind of universal gray. He was small and slight, with the kind of frame that suggested he had once been broader, stronger before age had pulled everything inward. His hair was white and thin, his clothes a button-down shirt that had been washed too many times. Work pants that pulled slightly around his ankles were dusty in a way that went beyond the afternoon's heat. There was grime on his collar, a smear of ash along one forearm. I wasn't watching the bikes. He wasn't watching anything. He was just sitting there with his hands folded in his lap, looking at the ground like a man who had learned long ago that making eye contact was a dangerous habit. Marcus sat on his bike for a moment. Around him, other riders were beginning to notice. Conversations dropped off. Engines idled down. Big Tom Haskell, 6'4" and built like a highway overpass, drifted up alongside Marcus and followed his line of sight. "Who is that?" Tom asked. "Don't know. Think he was in that shed fire." Marcus didn't answer. He was already dismounting. He walked across the dirt slowly, not because he was uncertain, but because he had learned years ago that approaching a frightened person, the way you'd approach a frightened animal, was not an insult. It was the most respectful thing you could do. He stopped a few feet away and crouched down to put himself at eye level with the man the way his mother had taught him to do with children, and the way 30 years of riding had taught him to do with everyone else. "Hey," Marcus said. "Just that, nothing more." The old man's eyes moved up slowly. They were blue, a pale, watered-down blue, the kind that starts bright and fades over decades. He studied Marcus with an expression that Marcus couldn't immediately read. Not fear exactly, more like the careful calculation of someone who had learned to assess threat before anything else. "I'm Marcus," Marcus said. "We're doing a veterans ride today. You a vet?" A pause, long enough that Marcus thought the man might not answer at all. "Korea," the man said finally. His voice was thin but clear with a slight roughness to it, like a radio signal coming through static. 52nd Infantry. I was 20. "That's a long time to carry that," Marcus said. Something shifted in the old man's face, not quite a smile, but something loosened slightly around his eyes the way a fist partially opens. "Harold," the man said. "Harold Bennett." "You live nearby, Harold." Harold's chin moved almost imperceptibly in the direction of the trailer park that backed up against the far end of the property. A cluster of single wides and double wides, half hidden by scrub brush, connected to the main road by a dirt track that looked like it flooded every monsoon season and never quite recovered. "Just over there," Harold said. Marcus nodded. He let the silence sit for a moment, comfortable with it, in the way that people who spend a lot of time on motorcycles become comfortable with silence. "You doing okay?" he asked. Harold's hands shifted slightly in his lap. A small movement, involuntary. "I'm fine," Harold said, and it came out too fast and too flat, with none of the natural variation that the word usually carried. It was the fine of someone who had said it so many times that it had lost all relationship with its original meaning. It was armor, not an answer. Marcus looked at Harold's hands. They were folded over one another in his lap, left hand over right, and the left sleeve of his shirt had ridden up slightly during the movement. Not much, just enough for Marcus to see the edge of something on his forearm. Something that didn't look like skin, something raised and dark and irregular. I didn't say anything. He didn't reach for it. He just looked back up at Harold's face and held the eye contact for a moment, and Harold must have seen something there, some question being asked without words, because Harold's jaw tightened and his hands pressed together harder in his lap. "It's nothing," Harold said, before Marcus had asked anything at all. Marcus kept his voice the way he kept his hands when he was diffusing something very, very still. "Can I look at your arm, Harold?" The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. This one had weight to it. Harold's breathing changed not dramatically, just a slight, shallowing, a fractional increase in speed. His eyes moved away from Marcus's face and fixed on some middle distance over Marcus's shoulder. And Marcus recognized that look. He had seen it on rookies before their first real fight. He had seen it on old men at funerals when the flag was handed over. It was the look of someone making a decision they hadn't expected to have to make today. "It's nothing," Harold said again, but this time the word came out barely above a whisper. Marcus waited. Behind him, he was aware that the noise of the gathering had dropped further. He could feel without looking that some of the men closest to him had moved slightly in his direction. Not intrusively, just present. "Harold," Marcus said softly, "I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to call anyone. I just want to look." Another long moment, and then Harold, with the slowness of a man performing an act of enormous effort, lifted his left arm and held it out toward Marcus. Marcus reached out and gently pulled the sleeve back. What he saw made the breath leave his body. The arm thin pale, the skin loose and papery, the way very old skin becomes, was covered from the wrist nearly to the elbow with circular burns. Dozens of them. Some were old enough that they had faded to silver-white scar tissue, smooth and shiny against the surrounding skin. Some were more recent still, pink at the edges, still slightly raised, and 2 or 3 of them clustered near the inside of the wrist were fresh enough that they hadn't fully closed. The skin around them was red and slightly swollen with the unmistakable dull sheen of beginning infection. Marcus looked at them for a long moment. His jaw was tight. Something was moving in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. It was bigger than anger and older than grief, and it had teeth in it. I knew what made burns like this. He had seen them before on people who had come out of very particular kinds of situations. They were round. They were uniform in size. They were spaced with a deliberateness that ruled out accident, that ruled out carelessness, that ruled out everything except intention. They were cigarette burns. Every single one of them. He gently let the sleeve down. He looked up at Harold. Harold was still looking at the middle distance. His lips were pressed together. His eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with happiness. "Harold," Marcus said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended, rougher than he intended. "Who did this to you?" Harold's throat moved. He swallowed once, and then his face crumpled, not into crying, not yet, but into something worse, something preparatory. The expression of someone trying to hold together something that has already broken. "Please," Harold whispered, "please don't tell anyone." "Who did this?" "He's my grandson." Harold's voice broke on the last word, not loudly, just a small fracture like a hairline crack in old concrete. "He's the only family I have left." Marcus sat back on his heels. Behind him, complete silence had fallen over the nearest cluster of bikers. He didn't need to look to know that Big Tom was standing about 8 feet away with his arms crossed, and that Danny Reeves had stopped pretending to adjust his saddlebags, and that at least 10 other men and women were close enough to have heard what Harold had just said. He looked at Harold's face, the shame in it, the exhaustion in it, the terrible bone-deep loneliness in it. And he understood in that moment that he wasn't looking at a man who needed rescuing from a fire. He was looking at a man who had been burning for a very long time. Quietly, invisibly, in a trailer just over the edge of the lot where nobody could see the smoke. "Okay," Marcus said. "Okay, Harold. We're not going to do anything today that you don't want us to do. Harold's exhale was shaky and long, the release of a breath held for what might have been years. Thank you, Harold whispered. Marcus straightened up. He turned around and every eye in the group that had gathered nearby was on him. He looked at them steadily at Tom's jaw, set like concrete at Danny's eyes, which were doing something complicated at a dozen other faces that were processing the same thing he was processing. He gave the smallest shake of his head. Not yet. Not like this. Everyone understood. They broke apart, naturally wandering back to their bikes, resuming the ordinary noise and motion of the gathering. But something had changed. Something had been added to the fabric of the day that hadn't been there before, and all 395 of them felt it. Marcus rode the memorial route, the way he always did at the front of the formation, the wind in his face, the highway opening up ahead of him like a conversation. But his mind wasn't on the road. It kept returning to Harold's arm, to the precision of those burns, to the way they were clustered and layered, old ones under new ones over old ones, like a calendar made of pain. A person didn't acquire burns like that through a single episode of rage. A person didn't acquire them through carelessness or accident or even a single terrible night. Burns like that accumulated over time. They were a practice, a routine, something returned to again and again with patience and with purpose, which meant whoever was doing it had been doing it for months, maybe longer. And Harold had been protecting him, calling him family, refusing to name him, looking at the ground with those faded blue eyes and saying, please don't tell anyone, with the particular desperation of someone who believed that losing his abuser was the same as losing everything. Marcus had seen a lot of things in his life. He had been present at violence, had sometimes participated in it, had always understood it as part of the world he moved through. He was not a naive man, and he was not a sentimental one. But there was something about the specific combination of Harold's age and Harold's silence, and Harold's request, he's the only family I have left, that settled into him like a coal and refused to go out. When the ride returned to the staging area 4 hours later, Marcus didn't immediately go to his truck. He stood beside his bike for a while, watching the crowd thin out, watching families pack up and riders drift toward the highway. I was still standing there when Tom walked up beside him. You going back over there? Tom asked. Yeah. Want company? Marcus looked at him. Tom's expression was neutral in the way that people who feel things very strongly sometimes make their expressions neutral. Yeah, Marcus said, but quiet, no crowd. They found Harold exactly where they had left him, still in the lawn chair, still looking at the ground. The light had shifted. It was late afternoon now, the sun beginning its long desert descent, and Harold looked smaller in it, somehow more exposed. Marcus brought a water bottle from his saddlebag. He handed it to Harold without comment. Harold took it and drank with the careful, measured sips of someone who had learned not to assume there was more where that came from. You eaten today? Tom asked. Harold looked up at him. Tom was an impressive physical specimen, 6'4", 260 pounds, with a beard that had gone gray at the edges and arms like bridge cables. Most people took a moment when they first registered Tom's presence. Harold took his moment. Then he said, I had some crackers this morning. Tom's expression didn't change, but his eyes moved briefly to Marcus, and Marcus gave an almost imperceptible nod. Tom turned and walked back toward the staging area without another word. Marcus sat down in the dirt beside Harold's lawn chair, not on a bike, not standing, and actually sat down in the red Arizona dirt with his knees up and his arms on his knees, making himself small, making himself level. I'm going to come back, Marcus said. Next week, and the week after that. That okay with... Harold studied him for a long moment. Why? Harold asked. It was a genuine question, not rhetorical, not suspicious, or not only suspicious. It was the question of a man who had spent a long time without a satisfactory answer to it and had stopped expecting one. Because you're a vet, Marcus said, and because you deserve better than what's happening. You don't know what's happening. No, Marcus agreed. I don't, not all of it. Harold looked back at the ground. His hands moved slightly in his lap, that same small fidgeting motion from earlier. He's not always like that, Harold said quietly. Ethan, he's not always. He stopped, started again. He was a good boy when he was little, real good. He used to ride his bike over to my place every Saturday morning, and I'd make him pancakes. Blueberry, that was his favorite. A pause. He still likes blueberries. Marcus said nothing. He let Harold have the memory for a moment. Things got hard for him. Harold continued. He had some trouble. Lost his job, then another job. Had some debts. Another pause longer this time. He needed somewhere to stay, and I needed... He stopped again. His voice had gotten very quiet. I was alone. After my wife passed, I was alone. 37 years we were married. 37 years and then nothing. Just quiet. Just the same four walls every day. So he moved in, Marcus said. He moved in, Harold agreed. And for a while it was good. It was something. Having someone in the house, hearing someone in the kitchen. It was good. He exhaled slow and careful. Then he started having trouble again. With money, and then with other things. What other things? Harold's hands pressed together. He has a sickness, Harold said finally. The word came out with the careful precision of someone who had chosen it deliberately, who had thought about it a great deal and decided that this was the most accurate one. With gambling, it's a sickness. He can't help it. Harold, Marcus said, does he help it when he burns your arm? The silence was immediate and absolute. Harold's hands stopped moving. His whole body went very still. The stillness of something that has been struck and is waiting to find out how badly. And then slowly he turned his head and looked at Marcus. Really looked at him the way he hadn't quite done before. With those faded blue eyes that had seen a 20-year-old kid's war in a 50-year marriage, in the inside of a burning house, in 37 years of quiet and whatever it was that happened in that trailer behind the scrub brush. No, Harold said. His voice was barely above a whisper. He doesn't. Tom came back with a paper bag from one of the food vendors. He set it down beside Harold's chair without fanfare. Harold looked at it for a moment, then at Tom, and Tom just shrugged and found himself a patch of ground to sit on. They stayed there for 2 hours, talking about nothing in particular, the ride, the heat, the history of the Veterans Memorial event. Tom had a story about a breakdown he'd had on Route 89 that took 15 minutes to tell and made Harold smile twice and almost laugh once. Marcus talked about a ride he'd done through New Mexico years ago, the way the landscape changed colors at dusk, the particular silence of the high desert. Harold ate everything in the bag. He drank 2 more water bottles. He talked about Korea, not the fighting, but the cold. The kind of cold that was different from anything in Arizona. The kind that got inside your clothes and your bones and your sleep and never entirely left. He talked about coming home, about the way people looked at him on the street in 1954, not with hostility, not yet with the complicated feelings that came later, but with a kind of blankness. You were away, and now you're back, and that's all that was somehow lonelier than hostility would have been. By the time the sun was fully down and the stars were coming out in that extraordinary Arizona way, Harold was sitting a little straighter in his chair. Not much, but a little. When Marcus stood up to leave, Harold looked up at him. You said you'd come back, Harold said. I will. People say that. I know they do. Marcus looked at him steadily. I'll be here next Wednesday. About noon, if that's okay. Harold seemed to be measuring him, calculating the probability of something. I'll be here, Harold said finally. Not like I go many places. Marcus nodded. He turned to go. Marcus, Harold's voice quiet and careful. Marcus turned back. Harold looked at him for a long moment. His expression was something that Marcus would think about later, turning it over in his mind, the way you turn over a thing you found and aren't sure what it is yet. It was gratitude, but it was also terror. It was relief, but it was also grief. It was the expression of someone standing at the edge of something they cannot see the bottom of. He's not a bad person, Harold said. I want you to understand that. He's sick. He needs help. I'm not asking you to... He stopped, his hands pressed together hard. I just want you to understand. I hear you, Marcus said. He walked back to his bike in the dark. Tom fell into step beside him. Neither of them said anything for a while. Finally, Tom said, how do you want to handle this? Marcus swung his leg over his bike and sat for a moment with his hands on the bars. Carefully, he said, and if careful doesn't work. Marcus looked back toward the trailer park. In the dark, it was invisible, just a smear of distant lights behind the scrub brush. Careful is going to work, he said, because it has to, because if we go at this the wrong way, we lose him. He'll shut down, he'll protect the grandson, and that man will be alone again with someone who burns him with cigarettes. Tom was quiet for a moment. So we just, visit, bring groceries? We visit, Marcus said. We bring groceries. We fix things that need fixing. We become the kind of people he trusts enough to tell the truth to. That could take months. Yeah, Marcus said, it could. He started his engine. The sound rolled out across the desert, deep and constant. Harold Bennett survived the Korean War, Marcus said loudly enough to be heard over the engine. He can survive a few more months. The question is whether we can do what needs to be done without making it worse. Tom mounted his own bike. In the starlight, his expression was unreadable. What does need to be done? He asked. Marcus looked straight ahead at the road. Justice, he said, but the kind that lasts, the kind Harold can live in after it's over. He pulled out onto the highway. Behind him in a trailer park that nobody drove past on purpose, Harold Bennett sat alone in the dark with his hands folded in his lap, listening to the sound of motorcycles fading into the distance. He sat there for a long time, and for the first time and longer than he could clearly remember, he didn't feel quite as alone as the silence said he was. Marcus kept his word. Wednesday came and he was there at noon, exactly pulling up the dirt track toward the trailer park with a bag of groceries balanced across his tank and Tom riding behind him. He hadn't called ahead. Harold didn't have a cell phone, or at least hadn't offered a number, so he just showed up the way he'd said he would, the way he always did with things that mattered. Harold was sitting on the small wooden porch outside his trailer. He was in the same lawn chair, or one very similar to it, and he was holding a coffee mug that looked empty. When he heard the bikes coming up the track, his head came up fast, a sharp animal alertness that told Marcus everything about what sounds usually meant in Harold's world. Then Harold saw who it was and something in his face settled. Not smiled, not relaxed, just settled, the way a held breath releases. Told you, Marcus said, dismounting. You did, Harold agreed. Tom held up the grocery bag. We didn't know what you needed, so we got a little of everything. Hope that's all right. Harold looked at the bag, then at Tom, then back at the bag. You didn't have to do that, Harold said. We wanted to, Tom said. And he said it the way Tom said most things, flatly as a statement of fact with no ornamentation around it. Harold stood up from the chair. He moved carefully the way people move when they've learned that certain movements cost more than they used to. He held the door open and they went inside. The trailer was small and Marcus took it in quickly, the way he took in most spaces, not analytically, not deliberately, but with the accumulated habit of someone who had spent decades moving through unfamiliar environments, in reading them without thinking about it. It was clean, or had been kept clean, but it had the specific tidiness of a space where someone had tried very hard to maintain order against considerable disorder. There were boxes stacked against one wall that didn't quite belong. A folding table that was pushed too far to one side, leaving a gap where something larger had recently been. An empty space near the kitchen counter, where a television had clearly sat, the ghost of it, visible in the slightly less faded rectangle of wall behind it. Tom saw it too. Marcus knew he did because Tom's eyes moved to that rectangle and stayed there for just a beat too long. Harold set his empty mug on the counter and opened a cabinet to pull out two more. The cabinet was nearly empty, not what you'd expect from someone who'd been home for decades. You want coffee? Harold asked. He stopped looking into the cabinet with a brief expression that he tried to suppress and didn't quite manage. I might be out of coffee. I brought some, Marcus said, pulling it from the bag. Dark roast. That okay? Harold looked at the coffee for a moment. His jaw moved slightly. That's fine, he said quietly. That's yes, thank you. They sat at the small kitchen table while the coffee brewed, and Marcus let the conversation come naturally, the way he'd learned was the only way conversation ever really came. He asked about the neighborhood, about how long Harold had lived there, about what the trailer park used to be like before it got run down. Harold talked. Slowly at first, then more easily. He'd been there since 2003 after he and his wife sold the house in Prescott when the upkeep got to be too much. The trailer had been nice enough then, not fancy but comfortable. His wife had put curtains up, planted tomatoes in a container on the porch every summer. Made it feel like something. When did she pass? Marcus asked. 7 years ago, Harold said, March the 14th. He said the date the way people say dates that have become permanent landmarks in their interior geography, March 14th, as specific and absolute as a coordinate. I'm sorry, Marcus said. Harold nodded once. Ethan came not long after. He'd been in Las Vegas, said he needed to get out of there, start fresh. I told him he could stay. He wrapped both hands around his mug. It seemed like the right thing, I had the space, and he's my daughter's boy. My daughter passed in '09, so he's the last of them. Of your family, Marcus said. Of any of them, Harold said. My wife's family, most of them are gone too, and my army friends, he shook his head. One by one, you get to my age and the phone stops ringing so much. Tom was quiet through most of this. He was good at quiet, good at taking up space without demanding anything from it, which was a rarer skill than most people realized. After a while, Harold showed them the leaking corner of the ceiling where the rain came through. Marcus looked at it and said he'd bring some materials next time and they'd fix it properly. Harold said he didn't want to be a bother. Marcus said he wasn't. They stayed for an hour and a half. When they left, Harold stood on the porch and watched them go down the dirt track, and Marcus could see him in the side mirror, small still watching, until they rounded the curve and he disappeared. His TV's gone, Tom said once they were back on the main road. I noticed. And half the food in that cabinet. I noticed that too. Tom rode in silence for a moment. Is the grandson there? Truck was gone, Marcus said. Wasn't there today? But he lives there. He lives there. Another silence. What kind of person, Tom started, and then stopped. Tried again. What kind of person burns an 87-year-old man with cigarettes and then goes out and leaves him with nothing in the cabinet? Marcus didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that was satisfying enough to say out loud. They went back the following Wednesday, and the one after that. On the third visit, Ethan was home. Marcus had been aware of him the moment he pulled up the truck in front of the trailer, a late model Ford that was in considerably better condition than anything else associated with Harold's existence, and a figure on the porch who stood up and came down the steps as soon as he heard the bikes. Ethan Bennett was 39 years old and looked like someone had taken a pleasanter version of Harold's bone structure and run it through a different machine. He was medium height, broad-shouldered, with blonde hair, cut short, and a face that had settled into an expression of easy, open friendliness that Marcus recognized immediately. He had seen that expression before, on people who wore it the way other people wore clothes because it served a purpose, because it made certain things easier. Hey, Ethan said, coming toward them with his hand already extended. Ethan Bennett. Harold's my grandfather. Heard he met some of you guys at the Veterans Ride a few weeks back. Marcus shook his hand, firm grip, practiced, the handshake of someone who understood that handshakes communicated things. Marcus Walker, Marcus said. We've been stopping by to check in on him. Hope that's all right. Oh, absolutely, Ethan said. And the friendliness in his voice was immediate and complete, not a single crack in it, not a moment's hesitation. That's great. I worry about him when I have to go out. He doesn't have a lot of people checking in. You know, it's really good of you. He's a veteran, Marcus said. We take care of veterans. Yeah. Ethan shook his head with an expression of warm appreciation. That's really something. That's a good thing. Harold had appeared in the doorway. He was standing slightly back from the threshold, not quite on the porch. And the way he was standing, weight shifted slightly rearward, shoulders, very slightly, elevated, told Marcus, something that Ethan's handshake and smile couldn't undo. Harold, Marcus said, looking past Ethan at the old man, we brought some things for the roof, if it's still a good time. Sure, Harold said. His voice was careful, calibrated. Ethan stepped aside with a gesture of perfect hospitality. Absolutely, go ahead. I'll get out of your way. I've got some errands to run anyway. He looked at Harold. You good, Pop? Fine, Harold said. Great. Ethan grabbed his keys from somewhere inside and came back down the steps, passing Marcus close enough that Marcus could see his eyes clearly for the first time. They were light hazel, maybe, and they were absolutely unreadable. Nice to meet you guys, he said. Really, thank you for looking out for him. He got in his truck and drove away. Tom watched the truck until it turned out of the dirt track. Pop, Tom said very quietly. I heard it, Marcus said. Harold hadn't moved from the doorway. Marcus looked at him. Harold's shoulders had dropped. The calibrated quality had gone out of his voice when he said, he'll be gone a few hours usually. Then let's get started on that roof, Marcus said. The pattern established itself over the following weeks with a natural, almost inevitable logic. They came on Wednesdays. Sometimes they brought one or two other riders, quietly selected, carefully chosen men and women who could be trusted to follow Marcus's lead, which meant taking their cues from Harold and never pushing. They brought groceries, they fixed the roof and then the wheelchair ramp, which had developed a dangerous give in its middle board, and then the water heater connection that Harold mentioned almost in passing one afternoon, describing it as a little temperamental. in the way that people describe serious problems when they've learned that describing things as serious doesn't seem to change anything. Harold began to talk more freely, not about Ethan, not directly, not yet, but around him in the way that people talk around things they're not ready to name. He'd mentioned something in passing, a reference to needing to ask Ethan about his medication, a brief remark about how his pension check had been late that month, a quick change of subject when Marcus asked whether he had enough for the week. Marcus listened to all of it and said very little and kept a record in his head that was growing more detailed with every visit. The medication was the first thing that crystallized clearly. Harold was on a daily regimen: blood pressure, blood thinner, something for his joints, and twice in 3 weeks he mentioned almost offhandedly that he'd been a few days without one of them because he was waiting for Ethan to pick up the refill. Marcus mentioned that he could bring the prescriptions himself if it would help. Harold said quickly that no, Ethan handled, that it was fine, it was no trouble. The second time it happened, Marcus asked which pharmacy. Harold gave him the name and then immediately said it wasn't necessary, really. Ethan had it in hand, it wasn't a problem. Marcus wrote the pharmacy name in his phone on the way home. Tom said blood pressure, medication. He's 87, that's not a few days situation. No, Marcus said, it's not. And the pension checks. Marcus had been thinking about the pension checks. Harold had mentioned them twice now, once in the context of needing to ask Ethan when the last one had arrived, once in the context of being a little short on something or other. Both times the mention had come and gone, quickly deflected by Harold, the way he deflected most things that pointed too directly at the center of what was happening. But VA pension checks were not complicated. They arrived on a schedule. They went to an address. If they weren't reaching Harold, there were a limited number of explanations for why. On the 5th week, Marcus arrived on a Wednesday and found Harold in the kitchen trying to reach something on a high shelf. Harold's coordination wasn't what it should have been. He was slightly unsteady on his feet, moving with a careful, deliberate slowness that was more pronounced than usual. You take your medication today? Marcus asked. A beat. Yeah, Harold said, another beat. Harold lowered his arm from the shelf. He looked at Marcus with an expression that was tired in a very specific way, the tiredness of someone who has been caught in a small thing and knows that the small thing points to a large one. He forgot to pick it up, Harold said. It's been about 5 days. I'm fine, it's fine. Which ones? Marcus asked. Harold told him. Marcus took out his phone. He called the pharmacy. He drove Harold there himself, sat in the waiting area while the prescription was filled, and drove him back. On the way, Harold sat in the passenger seat of Marcus's truck and looked out the window and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, he has a lot on his mind. Marcus kept his eyes on the road. He's trying, Harold continued. He's in a hard place. The debts, there's a lot of pressure on him. I understand that. I know what pressure does to people. What does it do to people? Marcus asked, carefully, genuinely. Harold was quiet for a moment. It makes them into something they don't want to be, Harold said. Temporarily, I believe that. I have to believe that. Marcus pulled up the dirt track to the trailer. He stopped the truck. Harold, he said, the burns on your arm. How many times in the past month? Harold's hands pressed together in his lap. That's between Ethan and me. How many times? A long silence. Twice, Harold said. So quietly, Marcus almost didn't hear it. He was very upset. He'd had a bad week. Marcus sat with that for a moment. He thought about how he wanted to say the next thing. He had to say it right. He only got one chance to say it right. Harold, he said, I need you to hear something. And I need you to hear it as something I mean, not as something I'm saying, 'cause I'm supposed to. Harold turned slightly in his seat. What happened to you in that trailer is not about his bad week, Marcus said. It's not about his debts or his pressure or his difficult situation. A bad week doesn't put cigarettes on a person's arm, and it doesn't stop because he feels better or because things get easier for him. It stops when someone makes it stop. Harold's eyes were very bright. He's my blood, Harold said, and his voice cracked on the last word just slightly, just for a moment, but enough. I know, Marcus said. I know he is. I don't have anyone else. I know that too. Harold turned back to the window. He sat there for a long time. I'm not ready, Harold said finally. I'm not there yet. I need more time. Okay, Marcus said. You're not going to push me. No, Marcus said. I'm not. Harold opened the truck door and got out slowly, and Marcus watched him make his way up the porch steps with his medication in a paper bag, and at the door Harold paused and looked back. "Next Wednesday?" Harold asked. "Next Wednesday," Marcus said. Harold nodded once. He went inside. Marcus sat in the truck for another few minutes before he pulled away. What he'd found out from the pharmacy was worse than he'd expected, and what he'd expected had not been good. He hadn't pushed. He hadn't asked for records he wasn't entitled to. He'd simply asked the pharmacist, a woman named Greta, who had been filling Harold's prescriptions for 4 years and who clearly cared about him in the particular way that small service people sometimes quietly care about their regulars, whether there was anything they could do to make sure Harold's medications were picked up on time. Greta had looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, carefully choosing each word, "I've been wondering if someone was going to ask me that." She told him that Harold's prescriptions were paid through his VA benefits, that for the first 3 years Harold had picked them up himself, that about 14 months ago Harold had called and said his grandson would be picking them up from now on, and that in those 14 months Ethan had picked them up on time approximately 40% of the time. 60% of the time Harold's medications had gone uncollected until Greta called and eventually reached someone who would come and get them, sometimes a week late, sometimes more. Marcus thanked her. He said he'd make sure they were picked up going forward. She said she'd appreciate that, and there was something in the way she said it that told him she had been waiting quietly and helplessly for someone to walk in and say exactly that. He talked to Danny Reeves that night. Danny was a retired claims adjuster who rode with the chapter on weekends and had, over the years, accumulated a working knowledge of elder care law that was broader and more current than most people would have guessed looking at him. "VA pension going missing," Danny said. "I don't know for certain it's going missing, but Harold can't account for the last 3 months of payments when I've been over there, and his pantry looks like what it looks like." "Does the grandson have access to his accounts?" "I don't know." "Find out," Danny said. "If he's been redirecting those payments or using Harold's accounts without authorization, that's financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. That's a felony in Arizona. That's not a domestic dispute, that's a crime. Harold won't report it." "I know," Danny said, "which is why the evidence has to be airtight before anyone makes a move. Because if someone goes at this and it falls apart, Ethan will know Harold talked, and Harold will be alone with him and whatever he decides to do about that." Marcus went quiet on his end of the phone. "Build it clean," Danny said. "Every detail, every date you can document, every observation. When you have enough that the DA can't ignore it even without Harold's cooperation, then you move, but not before. And in the meantime, Harold's still in there with him." "Yes," Danny said, "he is." Marcus sat with that for a long time after he hung up the phone. He sat with the particular weight of knowing that something was happening, that he could not yet stop knowing it clearly, specifically in full color, and having to wait. It was the hardest thing he'd done in years. He called Tom. "The pension checks," Marcus said. "I need to know if Ethan has his own name on Harold's accounts." "How do we find that out?" "We ask Harold the right question at the right moment, and we wait for him to trust us enough to answer it. And until then we show up every Wednesday," Marcus said. "We fix whatever's broken. We make sure his medications are filled. We make sure there's food in that cabinet. We make sure that every time Ethan looks at that old man and thinks about how alone he is, he's wrong." Tom was quiet for a beat. "You think Ethan knows we're building something?" Marcus thought about Ethan's handshake, his smile, the absolute practiced ease of his friendliness. "I think Ethan thinks we're a bunch of bikers doing a charity visit," Marcus said. "I think he thinks we'll lose interest." "Good," Tom said. "Let him think that." It was on the 7th week that Marcus arrived to find Harold with a fresh bandage on his left wrist. Not the arm this time, the wrist. And Harold was wearing a long-sleeved shirt in weather that was still solidly in the 80s, and he had it buttoned to the cuff. And when Marcus came in, Harold kept his left side slightly turned, not obviously, not dramatically, just a few degrees, just enough. Marcus set the groceries down. He talked about something inconsequential. He drank the coffee Harold made. He didn't look at the sleeve. He didn't ask. And then about 40 minutes in, Harold shifted in his chair, and the sleeve moved slightly, and Marcus saw the edge of the bandage. He still didn't say anything. Harold saw him see it, and Harold said almost conversationally, looking at his coffee, He needed money for something. I said I didn't have it. He got upset. I'm sorry, Harold, Marcus said. It healed fine, Harold said. The other ones, they always heal. You got something on that one antibiotic ointment. I think so. I think Ethan put something on it. Marcus breathed through that, the particular grotesquerie of the information that Ethan had applied the bandage to the wound he had made settled into him without expression. Harold, he said after a moment, I need to ask you something and I need you to give me an honest answer. Harold looked up from his coffee. Your bank accounts, Marcus said. Your pension payments. Is Ethan on those accounts? A very long silence. Harold set his mug down. He helped me set up a joint account, Harold said. After Margaret died, he said it would be easier, for bills and things, in case I needed help managing things. When was that? About 2 years ago. And does he use that account? Harold's hands went still on the table. He helps with expenses, Harold said carefully, from time to time. Harold, does he use that account without asking you first? The silence this time was different from all the other silences. It was the silence of someone who has arrived at a door they have been carefully walking toward and away from for a very long time, and who is standing in front of it and who cannot quite decide whether to open it. Harold looked at his hands. His voice when it came was very quiet. I don't always know what he uses it for, Harold said. I can't always, he stopped. His jaw was tight. The statements come by mail. He brings them in from the mailbox. I ask him to go over them with me and he says he will, and then he stopped again. And then he doesn't, Marcus said. Harold said nothing. Harold, Marcus said, he's stealing from you. The word landed in the room like something physical. Harold closed his eyes. He sat there with his eyes closed for a moment, an old man in a kitchen with a half-empty coffee mug and a bandaged wrist and 37 years of marriage photographs on a wall that still had Harold's wife's curtains on the windows, because Harold hadn't been able to take them down. He's all I have, Harold said. His voice was barely above a whisper. I know, Marcus said, and he's hurting you. Both of those things are true at the same time, Harold, and only one of them can end. Harold opened his eyes. He looked at Marcus across the small table with those faded blue eyes that had seen too much and held too much and were holding something now that was close to breaking. I'm scared, Harold said. I know you are. Not of him, Harold said. And then quieter, more honest, hitting something deep of being alone again, of going back to, he shook his head, of just the walls. Marcus leaned forward with his elbows on the table. Harold Bennett, he said, look at me. Harold looked at him. You are not going to end up alone, Marcus said. I'm telling you that as plainly as I can say it. Whatever happens with Ethan, whatever the right thing to do turns out to be, you are not going to be alone on the other side of it. Do you understand me? Harold studied him for a long moment. You can't promise that, Harold said. Watch me, Marcus said. Outside in the dirt track, 2 more bikes had pulled up. Marcus heard them arrive and heard them cut their engines and sit quietly the way he'd told them to come, present available, but not intrusive, not pushy, just there. Harold heard of them too. He looked toward the window, back at Marcus. How many of you are there? Harold asked. 395, Marcus said. Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then very slowly he reached up and began unbuttoning his left cuff. He rolled the sleeve back to the elbow. Both arms, both sides. He laid them on the table and let Marcus look. Marcus looked. He didn't look away, and he didn't react beyond the quietest, most controlled exhale. He counted what he could see. He noted what was old and what was new, and what was infected and what had healed wrong. How long? Marcus asked. About a year, Harold said, since it started. Does it happen every time he gets upset about money? Not every time, Harold said. Sometimes when it gets bad. And it's getting worse, Marcus said, not a question. Harold's eyes moved down to his arms. He looked at them for a moment, seeing them the way he must have stopped being able to see them with fresh eyes, with the eyes of someone who hadn't lived with them and normalized them and explained them away. Yes, Harold said, it's getting worse. Marcus pulled out his phone. Harold, he said, I'm going to ask you to let me record what you just told me. With your permission, only with your permission. You can say no and nothing changes. I'll still be here Wednesday. But if you let me record it, it becomes something that can protect you in ways that I currently can't. Harold looked at the phone. He was quiet for a long time, the longest time yet. And then Harold Bennett, 87 years old, Korean War veteran, last of his family, A man who had spent a year saying, "He's my grandson. He's the only family I have left." Said, "Not yet." Marcus lowered the phone. "Okay," he said, "but—" Harold stopped. His jaw worked. "But maybe. Soon." "Whenever you're ready," Marcus said. "I'll be here." He rolled Harold's sleeves back down for him gently and buttoned the cuffs, and Harold let him. And outside in the dirt track, 395 motorcycles waited in the form of two, patient and quiet and absolutely certain they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The word soon turned out to mean 3 more weeks. 3 more Wednesdays of groceries and coffee and careful conversation. 3 more weeks of Marcus watching Harold hold himself together with the particular tension of a man carrying something that was getting heavier every day. 3 more weeks of button cuffs and careful angles and the occasional slip of wince when Harold reached too quickly for something. A brief pause before he sat down that told Marcus his ribs were bothering him. A Tuesday phone call from Greta at the pharmacy saying Harold's blood pressure medication hadn't been picked up again, and she was worried because Harold's last reading had been high enough that she'd written it on a sticky note and put it on his file. Marcus picked up the prescription that day. Not Wednesday. Tuesday. He drove out there in the afternoon without calling ahead and found Harold on the porch in his lawn chair with his eyes closed and his face turned up toward whatever warmth the October sun still had in it. Harold heard him coming and opened his eyes, and for just a moment, one unguarded, undefended moment, his face did something that Marcus would carry for the rest of his life. It opened, like a window that had been painted shut for years suddenly giving way. Pure naked relief at the sight of someone familiar. Then the practiced composure came back and Harold said, "It's not Wednesday. It's Tuesday," Marcus agreed. Greta called, "Your blood pressure." He held up the bag. Harold looked at it. Something moved in his face. "He said he'd get it," Harold said. "I know. He was going to go this afternoon." Marcus sat down on the porch step. He didn't say anything. He just sat there with the bag and let the silence do what it needed to do. Harold reached out and took the bag. "Thank you," Harold said quietly. The words carried more weight than they usually did, more layers. They sat together for a while without talking. The desert was doing what it did in October afternoons, cooling faster than you expected, the light shifting toward gold. Harold took his medication with the water Marcus brought and set the glass down on the armrest of his chair with the careful precision of someone managing a body that required management. "I was out 2 nights last week," Harold said finally. Not looking at Marcus, looking at the middle distance. "Didn't come home. I didn't ask him where. I've learned not to ask." "Why not?" Harold's jaw tightened briefly. "Because when I ask, he reminds me how much he does for me. That I'd be in a home somewhere if it weren't for him. That I can't manage on my own." He stopped. He might be right about some of that. "He's not," Marcus said. "You don't know what I can and can't manage." "I know you managed for 80 years before he showed up," Marcus said. Harold was quiet for then unexpectedly, something like a ghost of a smile crossed his face and was gone. 80 and a half, he said. They sat a while longer. When Marcus left, Harold stood up from his chair and said, "Wednesday." Just that one word, like a confirmation, like a commitment. "Wednesday," Marcus said. The storm came on a Friday. It was the kind of desert storm that Arizona pulled out in October without much warning. A wall of purple-black cloud moving in from the north, dropping the temperature 20 degrees in 40 minutes, and arriving with the full drama of a landscape that did nothing by halves. The wind hit first, then the lightning, then the rain in sheets that turned the dirt tracks between trailers into fast-moving red streams. Marcus got a call at 7 in the evening from Harold, which was itself notable. Harold had the number but had never used it, not once in the 10 weeks they'd been coming out there, as though calling Marcus proactively was a line he hadn't felt he had the right to cross. "The power went out," Harold said. His voice was carefully neutral in the way it got when he was trying not to sound worried. "It's fine, I have candles. I just thought you should know in case you were planning. I don't know. I don't know why I called." "Is Ethan there?" A brief pause. "No," Harold said. Marcus thought about Harold alone in the dark in a trailer with inadequate insulation and a blood pressure condition and a recently infected burn wound on his wrist in a storm that the weather app on his phone was now telling him was going to run through midnight. "I'm coming out," Marcus said. "You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I'm coming." He called Tom. Tom was already getting his truck keys. Marcus called Danny Reeves and Danny said he'd meet them there. He called two more, Rita, who was an EMT and former Army medic and the most quietly capable person Marcus knew, and her husband Joe, who never went anywhere without a generator in his truck bed, because Joe had a philosophy about preparedness that bordered on religion. They got there within 45 minutes of Harold's call. Joe had the generator running and extension cords run inside within 20 minutes of arriving. Rita checked Harold's blood pressure high, but not dangerously so, and looked at his wrist and said the infection was tracking better than she'd expected, which Marcus chose to count as good news, even though everything about the context of the wound refused to let itself be counted as good news. Harold let them in and watched them organize his small space with a quiet, unguarded wonder that told Marcus he was not accustomed to people doing things for him without a calculation behind it. "You didn't have to bring all," Harold started. "Harold," Rita said without looking up from the blood pressure cuff she was tucking back into her bag. "We wanted to come. Please stop apologizing for letting us." Harold closed his mouth. He looked at her for a moment. "You were in the Army?" he asked. 8 years, Rita said. "Medic, 2 tours." Harold nodded slowly. Something settled between them that didn't need more words. They stayed. The storm wasn't clearing, and the power wasn't coming back, and there was no reason to leave, so they didn't. Joe made coffee on a camp stove he'd brought from his truck. Danny had thought to grab food. They pulled Harold's kitchen chairs into the living area and sat around the candles in the generator light, and the conversation moved the way it always moved when people stopped performing for each other, slowly at first, then fast, then deep. Harold talked about Korea again, more than he had before. The cold, yes, always the cold, but also the particular surreality of being 20 years old and trying to hold a position on a hill that changed hands 3 times in a week, and understanding somewhere in your body, in your bones, in a place below rational thought that whether you lived or died was a matter of inches and minutes in a kind of cosmic coin flip that had nothing to do with deserving. "You come home from something like that," Harold said, "and people want you to just be normal, go back to being whoever you were before. And you try. You try hard. But you're not the same person. You're just wearing the same face." Rita nodded, slowly. "Yeah," she said. "Yeah, that's exactly it." Harold looked at her. Something passed between them, the particular recognition of people who have carried the same weight in different packages. "Did it get better?" Harold asked. "Took a while," Rita said, "but yes, it got better." Harold nodded. Tom had been quiet most of the evening, sitting with his large frame folded into one of Harold's small kitchen chairs, in a way that should have looked absurd, but somehow didn't, holding a coffee mug that looked miniature in his hands. He'd been watching Harold all night with the attentiveness he brought to things he was trying to understand completely. Around 9:30, the storm picked up again, a fresh wave of rain hammering the roof and the wind doing something to one of the vents that made a periodic low moan. Harold pulled his sweater tighter, and Marcus noticed him wince slightly as the movement stretched his left arm. "Harold," Marcus said. Harold looked at him. "Is it worse tonight?" Marcus asked. "Meaning the wrist. Meaning everything." Harold was quiet for a moment. Around him, the room had stilled. Rita and Joe and Tom and Danny were all present, all part of the air of the room, and Harold looked at each of them briefly. These leather-jacketed people with their complicated histories and their inexplicable, persistent presence in his life, and something in him seemed to shift. "He came home Monday night," Harold said, and his voice had changed. The careful calibration was gone. What was left underneath it was something rawer. "He'd been gone since Thursday. I didn't know where. He came in and he went straight to the kitchen, and I heard him going through things, and I just asked if he'd had anything to eat." The room was very quiet. "He turned around," Harold continued, "and he looked at me the way he looks, sometimes not angry exactly, more like I'm an inconvenience, like I'm furniture that's gotten in the way." Harold's hands moved on the arms of his chair. "He said he needed money, that he needed it right now that night. He asked me how much was in the account." "What did you tell him?" Marcus asked. "I told him, didn't I, to know, which is true, I don't know what's in the account anymore. I stopped being able to keep track." Harold's jaw worked for a moment. He didn't believe me. He said I was keeping it from him, that I'd been complaining about him to people he'd heard. I had visitors, he said. He'd heard I'd been talking. Something tightened in Marcus's chest. "Did he know it was us specifically?" Marcus asked. "I don't think so. One of the neighbors probably. Someone saw the bikes." Harold's voice had gotten very quiet. He was very upset. He said some things, and then He stopped. The silence that followed had weight. You don't have to tell us what happened next, Rita said gently. No, Harold said. I think I do. I think I need to. He looked at his left wrist, at the sleeve that covered it. He held my arm down on the kitchen counter. He had his lighter. He said if I was going to talk about him to strangers, he was going to give me something worth talking about. Nobody in the room moved. He did it 4 times, Harold said, while I held still, because I've learned if I hold still, it ends sooner. The sound the storm made against the roof filled the silence. Tom's mug had stopped moving. His hand was completely still on the arm of his chair, and his face was doing something controlled and deliberate that Marcus recognized the look of a man applying enormous conscious effort to not doing what his body wanted to do. Harold looked at his sleeve. I told myself I wouldn't tell anyone, he said. I told myself it wasn't as bad as it sounds, that he was stressed, that he'd calm down. He looked up. But he doesn't calm down, he waits, and then something happens, or he needs money, or he loses somewhere, and then it happens again. His voice broke just once, just briefly. I'm tired. I am so tired of waiting for the next time. Marcus leaned forward. Harold, he said, I want to ask you something, same question as before, and you can still say not yet, and that's okay, but I need to ask again. Harold looked at him. Will you let me record what you just told us? Marcus said. Everything. All of it. On the record with your permission in your own words. The longest silence yet. The storm. The generator light. 5 people who had driven through a monsoon to sit in a dark trailer with a man they'd known for 10 weeks because it was the right thing to do, and they were people who did right things even when nobody made them. Harold looked around the room. He looked at Tom, whose face had gone still, and whose eyes were absolutely present. At Rita, who was watching him with the steady attention of someone who had done a great deal of waiting with people in terrible situations, and knew that the only thing that mattered right now was not making the wrong move. At Danny, who gave Harold the smallest, most careful nod. At Joe, who was looking at the floor because Joe understood instinctively that sometimes the kindest thing was to take up less space. Harold looked at Marcus. Yes, Harold said. Marcus took out his phone. He set it on the table between them, face up, the recording app open. He pressed record. The little red indicator came on. Tell me everything, Marcus said. From the beginning. Take as long as you need. Harold took a breath. And then Harold Bennett, 87 years old Korean War veteran, a man who had survived a hill that changed hands 3 times in a week, and 37 years of marriage and 7 years of silence. And 1 year of something that had no name that was polite enough to use in company, Harold Bennett began to talk. He talked for 2 hours. He talked about the joint account, how Ethan had suggested it 6 months after moving in, framing it as practicality, just easier. Pop, trust me, I'll handle the bills. How Harold had signed the papers without reading them carefully because Ethan had been right there and had said it was routine, and Harold had wanted to believe him. He talked about the first pension check that didn't make sense. How he'd asked Ethan, and Ethan had explained it smoothly immediately with the quick confidence of someone who had rehearsed the explanation, and Harold had almost believed him. How the next one didn't make sense either. How Harold had asked for the bank statements, and Ethan had said he'd get them and then hadn't, and Harold had asked again, and Ethan had gotten irritated, and Harold had learned not to ask. He talked about the truck, Harold's truck, a 2009 F-150 that Harold had owned for 11 years, that had been his wife's favorite thing about their retirement, that she had called the Silver Lady and had died before seeing it reach 100,000 miles. Ethan had asked to borrow it when his own car broke down. That was 14 months ago. Harold had never gotten it back. When he'd asked, Ethan had said he'd sold it because it needed repairs. Harold couldn't afford, and the money had gone toward their bills. Harold had never seen any accounting for that money. He talked about the power of attorney, how Ethan had brought papers home one evening about 18 months ago and said Harold needed to sign them, that it was important, that it was for Harold's protection, that Harold's doctors had mentioned Harold might need assistance with decisions going forward, and this was just being smart. Harold had signed. He hadn't had a lawyer review them. He'd been tired, and Ethan had been insistent, and Harold had wanted to believe that his grandson was trying to take care of him. He talked about the first time with the cigarette, 11 months ago. Harold had found a bank statement in a drawer, had gone looking for it, had searched while Ethan was out, had finally found it under the mattress in Ethan's room, had taken it to the kitchen table and spread it out and read every line. The amounts going out were 3 times what they should have been. To casinos, to cash withdrawals, to transactions Harold didn't recognize. When Ethan came home and found Harold at the kitchen table with the statement, he'd gone very still. And then he'd walked to the counter and picked up his cigarette and his lighter, and he'd looked at Harold across the kitchen with an expression that Harold had never seen on anyone in his life. And he said very calmly, "You shouldn't have gone through my things." Harold described what happened next in a voice that was flat and factual, the voice of someone who had long ago processed past the point of emotional texture and arrived at something more fundamental. He described it because Marcus had asked, and because the recording light was on, and because he had said yes, and Harold Bennett was not a man who said yes and then didn't mean it. When he finished, Rita had her hand over her mouth. Danny was looking at his coffee. Joe was very still. Tom was staring at a fixed point on the wall with the intensity of someone who was applying every tool they had to maintaining composure. Marcus was looking at Harold. Harold was looking at the recording on the phone. "Is that enough?" Harold asked. "That's enough," Marcus said quietly. "What happens now?" "Now," Marcus said, "I take this to someone who knows what to do with it. And you don't have to do anything yet. Nothing changes tomorrow. Nothing changes next week. You don't do anything differently. You don't say anything to Ethan. You just keep on." "Can you do that?" "Do it, Jam." Harold thought about it. "How long?" Harold asked. "Not long," Marcus said. "A few weeks at most." Harold nodded slowly. "There's something else," Harold said. Marcus waited. "The power of attorney," Harold said. "If he has it, if those papers say what I think they say, he can make decisions for me. Medical decisions, financial decisions. He could put me in a home." His voice was steady, but his hands were pressed hard together. "He's mentioned it once or twice. When I push back about something, he says sometimes he wonders if I'd be better in a facility." The room understood immediately what that meant. Not a concern about Harold's welfare, a threat, a reminder of what Ethan held. "The power of attorney," Danny said carefully, "can be challenged, especially if it was signed under conditions of coercion or without proper legal counsel. If the document was prepared and presented by the person named in it without independent review, a judge will look very hard at that." Harold looked at him. "You know about this," Harold said. "Some," Danny said. Harold studied him for a moment. "Ethan told me lawyers were too expensive, that we didn't need them." "Of course he did," Danny said quietly. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to ease, the hammering on the roof tapering to a steady rain, the wind dropping from its earlier howl to something more manageable. The generator hummed steadily. The candles Marcus had lit earlier were burning low. Harold sat in his chair with his hands in his lap, and the recording stopped, and everything he'd carried for 11 months now, distributed somehow among these 5 people who had no obligation to him and had chosen to sit in his dark living room on a Friday night anyway, and he looked smaller than usual, not weaker, smaller in the way that people look when they put down something heavy, temporarily unsteady, from the absence of the weight they'd adapted to carrying. "I believed he'd get better," Harold said, into the air, not to anyone specifically. "I kept thinking he's sick, he's in trouble, he needs help, and I'm his family, and family doesn't give up on each other. My wife would have—" He stopped. His voice had gone rough. "She would have known what to do. Margaret always knew what to do. She had a way of seeing things clearly when I couldn't." "What do you think she'd tell you now?" Rita asked. Gently, very gently. Harold was quiet for a long moment. "She'd tell me to stop protecting the person who's hurting me," Harold said. "She'd say it in a nicer way, but that's what she'd mean." A pause. She didn't have a lot of patience for people who hurt the people she loved. The ghost of something, affection, memory, grief, so old it had become simply part of his texture, moved across Harold's face. "She sounds like someone I would have liked," Rita said. "Everyone liked Margaret," Harold said. And for a moment he was somewhere else entirely, somewhere with curtains on the windows and blueberry pancakes on a Saturday morning, and a woman who knew what to do and wasn't afraid to do it. "She was the best person I ever knew." They sat with that for a moment. The rain on the roof, the generator light, 5 people and an old man, and the recorded truth of everything that had been done to him, now existing in the world outside his own carrying of it. Marcus picked up his phone and looked at the recording. 47 minutes and 23 seconds. He had said a few weeks. He had meant it. He pressed send to Danny's number. "Backup copy immediately." Danny's phone buzzed. He picked it up and looked at it, and then looked at Marcus and gave a nod that said he understood what it was and what it needed to be. Harold, Marcus said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it the way I mean it. Harold looked at him. What you just did, Marcus said, took more guts than most people have in them. I want you to know that. What you did tonight is what's going to make the difference. Harold looked at his hands. I just talked, Harold said. You just told the truth about something that was hurting you to people you trusted enough to tell it to, Marcus said. For a lot of people, that's the hardest thing there is. You did it anyway. Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said he forged the power of attorney's signature. I'm not sure, but when I signed those papers, I signed my name differently than I usually do. There was someone else's signature under mine on one of the pages, and when I asked about it, Ethan said it was the notary. The room went very still. Marcus looked at Danny. Danny's expression had gone sharp and focused. If the document was forged, Danny said carefully, that's not just elder abuse. That's fraud. That's a felony at the federal level potentially, especially involving VA benefits. Harold looked at him. There was a letter, Harold said, about 8 months ago from the VA, about a change to my benefit disbursement. I never requested any change. When I asked Ethan about it, he said it was routine. His voice was very quiet now. I don't think it was routine. No, Danny said, I don't think it was either. Marcus looked at Harold across the room, across the candlelight and the generator, hum and the last of the storm, and thought about what it meant that this man had held all of this inside himself for 11 months, had carried it through every Wednesday visit, every cup of coffee, every conversation about Korea and the cold in Margaret's curtains, had carried it while saying he's my blood and he's not always like that, and he was a good boy when he was little. Had carried it because he believed that losing the person who was hurting him was worse than being hurt. Harold, Marcus said, whatever happens next, whatever the process looks like, however long it takes, I need to know something. Harold waited. Do you want this to stop? Marcus said. Not do you want him punished, not do you want justice. Specifically, do you want this to stop? Harold looked at his left arm, at the sleeve over his wrist. He looked up. Yes, Harold said. His voice was the clearest it had been all night. No tremor, no calibration, no careful management of distance between the word and what it cost. Just yes. Okay, Marcus said. He reached out and put his hand briefly on Harold's arm, above the wrist, above the sleeve, on a part of him that wasn't hurt. Then it's going to stop, Marcus said. Harold looked at him for a long moment. And then he did something Marcus had not seen him do before, not in 10 weeks of Wednesdays, and one Tuesday with a pharmacy bag, and one Friday with a storm and a generator. And the truth finally said out loud. Harold put his hand over Marcus's hand, just for a moment, just briefly. And then he straightened up in his chair and cleared his throat and said he supposed they might as well finish the coffee while it was still warm. Tom got up to get the mugs. Danny stepped outside to make a phone call to a prosecutor he'd worked with 3 years ago on an unrelated case, a woman named Selena Torres, who was thorough and patient and had a particular reputation for elder exploitation cases that Danny had always considered one of the better things about the Coconino County DA's office. She answered on the third ring. Danny, she said, it's late. I know, Danny said. I have a recording and a witness and 11 months of a pattern, and I think we have forgery on top of everything else. A pause. How old is the victim, she said. 87, Korean War vet. Another, shorter. Send me what you have tonight, Selena said. I'll look at it first thing. Danny looked back through the small window of the trailer at Harold sitting in his chair with a fresh cup of coffee and Tom Haskell perched on a kitchen chair that was visibly too small for him. And Harold was saying something that was making Tom smile slightly, which was itself a thing that didn't happen often enough. Thank you, Selena, Danny said. Don't thank me yet, she said. Get me the rest of what you have and we'll see what we're working with. Danny hung up. He stood outside for a moment in the last of the rain, letting it fall on his face, thinking about the specific, particular courage of an 87-year-old man who had decided on a stormy Friday night in a dark trailer in Arizona that he was finally tired enough of being afraid that he was willing to try something else. He went back inside. Harold was telling Tom about the Silver Lady, the truck Ethan had sold, how Margaret had named it on the day Harold drove it off the lot, how she'd laughed at herself for naming a truck and then defended it by saying that anything you spent that much time with deserved a name. Tom was listening with his full attention in the way Tom listened to things he intended to remember. "What would you do if you had it back?" Tom asked. "The truck." Harold thought about it. "I'd drive out to where Margaret is buried," Harold said, "in Prescott. I haven't been out there since it's been too long. I'd go out there and sit for a while." He looked at his coffee. "Tell her what's been happening. Get her opinion on things." The room held that for a moment. "We'll get you out there," Marcus said, "one way or another." Harold looked at him, measured the words, decided to believe them. "Okay," Harold said. Outside, the rain had almost stopped. The sky was beginning to clear in patches, revealing the first stars. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called that particular desert sound, wild and clear and indifferent to everything that happened under it, and Harold heard it, and his face went briefly peaceful with something that was close to recognition. The recording was already on its way to Selena Torres. The evidence was in motion. The process, once begun, would follow its own logic to its necessary end. And in a small trailer in a forgotten corner of Flagstaff, Arizona, an 87-year-old man who had spent 11 months alone with an unbearable secret finally let himself be surrounded by people who were not going anywhere. Selena Torres called Danny back at 7:45 the following Monday morning. Danny was on his second cup of coffee and his first hour of reviewing the documents he'd spent the weekend compiling bank records he'd obtained through channels that were entirely legal and had taken him most of Saturday VA correspondence that Harold had agreed to let him photograph on Sunday afternoon, and the 47-minute recording that Danny had listened to 3 times now, each time hearing something new in the silences between Harold's words. "I've reviewed everything you sent," Selena said. She had the voice of someone who had been doing serious work for a long time and had lost the capacity for unnecessary preamble. "The recording is solid, his account is consistent and specific. The financial documentation corroborates the timeline he describes." "And the power of attorney?" Danny asked. "That's where it gets interesting." A brief pause. "I had our forensic document examiner look at the copy you photographed. The notary stamped the seal. It's a real notary. But the notary's name attached to that stamp retired from practice in 2019, 3 years before those papers were supposedly executed." Danny set down his coffee cup. "So someone used a dead stamp," he said. "Someone used a retired notary's stamp to authenticate a document," Selena said carefully. "Which means the document was either forged entirely or executed without proper notarization and fraudulently represented as legal. Either way, it's not valid, and either way, it's a crime. How many charges are we looking at?" He heard paper moving on her end. "Elder abuse physical, that's a Class 2 felony in Arizona. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, also Class 2. Theft, which we can charge separately given the amounts involved. Forgery of a legal document. Fraud in connection with VA benefits, which brings in federal jurisdiction." Another pause. "Danny, if the VA benefit diversion is what Harold's records suggest, we're potentially looking at federal wire fraud on top of everything else." Danny was quiet for a moment. "Will you take it?" he asked. "I already have," Selena said. "I filed for an emergency protective order this morning pending the hearing, and I'm requesting a court date within 30 days. A beat. I want Harold in that courtroom. I need him to testify." "He said he would," Danny said. "He said yes." "Good, because juries look at an 87-year-old Korean War veteran and they hear testimony about cigarette burns and stolen pension checks and a forged power of attorney, and they don't forget that in the deliberation room." Her voice carried something that wasn't unprofessional, but was definitely personal. "Make sure he knows he won't be alone in there." "He won't be," Danny said. He called Marcus before he'd even set the phone down from Selena's call. Marcus picked on the first ring, which meant he'd been awake and waiting, which meant he'd slept about as well as Danny had. "It's moving," Danny said. "Hearing in 30 days. She's going after everything state and federal." A pause on Marcus's end. "Does Harold know yet?" Marcus asked. "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first." "I'll tell him," Marcus said. "Today. I'm going out there this afternoon." "Marcus," Danny stopped, chose his next words carefully. "Ethan is going to find out a court date has been filed. Not immediately, but before the hearing. When he does, I know," Marcus said. "Harold needs to not be alone in that trailer when that happens." "I know," Marcus said again. "I'm already working on it." What Marcus was working on specifically was something he'd been thinking about since the Friday night of the storm, when he'd driven home at 2 in the morning and sat in his driveway for 20 minutes processing everything Harold had said into the recording. He'd thought about Selena's process and Danny's evidence and the legal machinery that was now in motion. And he'd thought about the gap, the 30 days between now and the hearing, the 30 days during which Ethan Bennett would continue living in that trailer with Harold, and at some point would become aware that something was happening, and at that point would become dangerous in a way that was no longer slow and systematic, but urgent and cornered. A cornered person was a different kind of threat than a confident one. Marcus had spent the weekend making phone calls, not just to Danny and not just to the chapter. He called veterans chapters in Tucson and Phoenix and Sedona. He called the chapter president in Albuquerque, a man named Ray Cortez, who had known Marcus for 15 years and trusted him without requiring detailed explanation. He called 3 other presidents in California and 2 in Nevada. He didn't tell them everything, he told them enough. He told them there was a veteran. He told them what had been done to the veteran. He told them there was going to be a court date. Every single one of them said the same thing: tell us when and where. Marcus drove out to Harold's trailer on Monday afternoon with groceries and the news, in a plan he hadn't quite finished formulating, but had the essential shape of. Harold was on the porch. Ethan's truck was gone. Marcus sat down across from Harold at the kitchen table and said it plainly the way Harold had shown him he preferred things said. They're moving on it, Marcus said. There's a prosecutor named Selena Torres. She's looked at everything, the recording, the bank records, the power of attorney. Harold, that document was forged. The notary stamp on it belongs to someone who retired 3 years before you signed it. Harold went very still. He told me it was legitimate, Harold said. It's not. Harold's face moved through several things fast in sequence. Shock first, then a particular kind of grief that was different from the grief of losing someone. It was the grief of a truth finally confirmed, the grief of being proved right about something you desperately wanted to be wrong about. He planned it, Harold said. Not a question. Yes, Marcus said, from early on. Harold sat with that. He sat very straight in his chair, the way he always sat when something hit him hard, his spine going rigid, his chin lifting slightly, the posture of a man who had spent his life deciding to stand up rather than fold. There's going to be a hearing, Marcus continued, in about 30 days. Selena needs you there. She needs you to testify. I said I would. I know. She knows. Marcus looked at him steadily. But between now and then, I need to talk to you about the next few weeks, about being safe. Harold met his eyes. You think he'll find out? Yes, not immediately, but before the hearing. Harold's jaw tightened. And when he does? He's going to be scared, Marcus said. Scared people who've been doing what he's been doing don't respond well when they realize the ground is shifting under them. Harold was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands, at the sleeve over his left wrist. What are you suggesting? Harold asked. I'm suggesting that you not be alone in this trailer between now and the hearing, Marcus said. I'm suggesting that someone is here every day, not just Wednesdays, every day. Harold looked up. That's a lot to ask of people, Harold said. We want to do it, Marcus said. You have lives, you have houses and families and... Harold. Marcus's voice was quiet but completely firm. This is not a negotiation. This is us telling you what we're going to do. If you want to participate in deciding the schedule, we can do that. But we are going to be here. Harold looked at him for a long, long moment. Why, Harold said, and there was something very raw in the question. Something genuinely bewildered, the question of a man who had been reduced for so long to measuring the world by what it took from him that he had lost the calculus for what people could give without being owed. Because you're worth it, Marcus said, simply, plainly, without decoration. Harold looked away. He looked at the window, at Margaret's curtains, still there, still the same faded blue they'd always been. He looked at them for a long time. Okay, he said finally, okay. The schedule built itself with the organic efficiency of people who believed in what they were doing. Rita came Mondays and Thursdays, primarily because she was an EMT with a flexible schedule, and also because she and Harold had developed a shorthand around his medical care that was matter-of-fact and unpatronizing in a way Harold clearly appreciated. Tom came Tuesdays, arriving at 10 in the morning and staying until early afternoon. And he and Harold had developed a peculiar ritual of listening to baseball radio broadcasts together, not talking much, just sitting with the game, the way men of a certain disposition sit with things they find comfortable. Danny came Wednesdays, which was already the established day, and on those visits, he would sometimes quietly review documents with Harold, getting additional details he needed for Selena's case preparation. Joe and two other riders rotated the remaining days. Ethan came and went. He noticed the increased presence and he smiled his practiced smile at whoever happened to be there and said how great it was that Harold had friends. He said it so consistently and with such polished conviction that Marcus sometimes wondered if Ethan believed it himself, if the performance had become so habitual that the performer had lost track of where it ended. But Marcus watched his eyes, and Ethan's eyes, unlike his smile, did not perform. They registered. They tracked. They moved between Harold and the visitors with a calculation that was entirely different from the warmth of his expression, the way a thermostat measures something unrelated to the weather outside. 2 weeks after Selena filed, Ethan found out. Marcus didn't know how, whether a neighbor had said something, whether Ethan had contacts at the courthouse, whether some piece of correspondence had arrived that Marcus's team hadn't intercepted first. But on a Thursday afternoon, Rita called Marcus from outside the trailer, speaking in the low-controlled voice she used when she needed to communicate urgency without communicating panic. "He knows," she said. "He came home an hour ago and he went straight to Harold. I was in the kitchen. I heard him say Selena Torres's name. I came out and put myself in the room." A brief pause. "He's not yelling. That's almost worse. He's talking very quietly and very nicely, and Harold is not moving." "I'm on my way," Marcus said. "I was there in 22 minutes. Tom was 10 minutes behind him, having gotten the same call." When Marcus walked in, Ethan was sitting across from Harold at the kitchen table in the exact seat Marcus usually occupied, leaning forward with his elbows on the table and his expression doing its warmth routine at maximum power. "Marcus," Ethan said when Marcus came through the door. He said it pleasantly without surprise, as though Marcus's arrival were expected and welcome. "Good timing. I was just talking to Pop about some confusion with some paperwork." "It's not confusion," Marcus said. He kept his voice level and he stood where he stood and didn't move further into the room. He was aware of Harold's face still composed, chin lifted, and he was aware of the specific quality of the stillness, the kind that came from practice. Ethan's smile stayed in place. "I'm not sure what you've been told, but there's been some miscommunication about—" "Ethan," Marcus said his name the way you set something heavy down. "The prosecutor has the recording. She has the bank records. She has a forensic analysis of the power of attorney document." A pause. "We should probably stop pretending this is about paperwork." The smile didn't disappear. That was the impressive and disturbing thing about it. It was too well practiced to disappear on command. But something changed in Ethan's eyes. The calculation shifted. Something colder moved through it. "You had no right," Ethan said. Still pleasant, still controlled. "To involve yourself in a private family situation." "Harold is a veteran," Marcus said, "and he's my friend. And what you did to him isn't a private family situation. It's a crime, several crimes." "Harold," Ethan turned back to his grandfather. "Pop, look at me. You don't have to do this. Whatever they've told you, you don't have to go to court. You don't have to testify. We can work this out ourselves. Family works things out." Harold looked at his grandson, and Harold said quietly and clearly, "We're not working this out ourselves, Ethan." Something flickered across Ethan's face. Very quickly, very briefly, and then it was gone, replaced by something that looked like hurt and probably wasn't. "I've given up everything for you," Ethan said. His voice had shifted, warmer now, softer, appealing to something. "I moved here to take care of you. I've managed everything, your medications, your finances, You stole my pension," Harold said. "You forged legal documents with my name on them. You held my arm down on the kitchen counter." His voice was very steady. "I know what you've done, Ethan. I was there." The room was completely silent. Ethan looked at Harold for a long moment, at the steadiness of him, at the lifted chin, in the clear eyes, in the absence of the fear that had apparently been Ethan's primary navigational tool for the past year. Something shifted in Ethan's posture. Subtle, but Marcus caught it, a micro-adjustment, a recalculation. "I need you to leave," Ethan said to Marcus. "This is my grandfather's home and I'm asking you to leave." "I'm going to stay," Marcus said. "Harold." Harold looked at Marcus. "Stay," Harold said. Tom came through the door behind Marcus. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, which was an extremely effective thing for a man of Tom's dimensions to do. Ethan looked at Tom, looked back at Marcus. The calculation in his eyes went through several phases quickly like a machine running through options. "This isn't over," Ethan said, to Marcus, not to Harold. And then he stood up and went down the hallway to his room and closed the door. Marcus let out a slow breath. Harold was looking at his hands on the table. They were completely steady. "You okay?" Marcus asked. "Yes," Harold said. And then after a beat, "That's the first time I've said those things to his face." "How did it feel?" Harold thought about it for a moment. "Terrifying," he said, "and like something I should have done a year ago." Ethan left the trailer 3 days later. He packed what he could fit in his truck in 2 trips and he left without saying anything to Harold, which was a particular kind of answer to its own particular kind of question. Harold watched from the kitchen window as Ethan's truck went down the dirt track and turned onto the main road and became part of the distance. He stood at the window for a long time after the truck was gone. Rita was at the kitchen table behind him, giving him the silence without filling it. Finally, Harold said, "I thought I'd feel worse." "What do you feel?" Rita asked. Harold considered. "Quiet," he said. "I feel quiet." He turned from the window. "Is that wrong?" he asked. "That I feel quiet?" "No," Rita said. "No, Harold, that's not wrong at all." The hearing was on a Thursday in late November, 26 days after Selena Torres had filed. Marcus had made his calls weeks ago. He had communicated the time and the address and the essential nature of what was happening. And he had said nothing about numbers or logistics or expectation because with the people he was calling, none of that was necessary. He had said there is a veteran, he is going to walk into a courthouse alone, and that should not happen. He drove to the courthouse at 6 in the morning. The hearing wasn't until 10, and what he found when he pulled off the main road stopped him completely. They were already there. Not dozens, not a manageable crowd that fit neatly on a sidewalk. They were lining both sides of the street for 2 full blocks in either direction from the courthouse entrance. Hundreds of motorcycles parked in a formation so precise it looked organized by someone who cared about geometry, which nobody had told anyone to do. They had simply arrived and arranged themselves with the natural order of people who knew how to hold a line. Chapter patches from Flagstaff, from Tucson, from Phoenix, from Albuquerque, from 3 California chapters from Nevada. Veterans from other clubs who had heard through networks that moved information the way water moved through desert rock, finding every channel. Riders. Marcus had never met in person who had come because the call had gone out and the call had been enough. 395 motorcycles. Marcus sat on his bike at the end of the street and looked at all of it and had to take a moment. Tom pulled up beside him. "You knew this was coming," Tom said. "I hoped," Marcus said. "There's a difference." Marcus didn't answer. He drove slowly down the street through the columns of bikes and riders, and the people he passed nodded at him or raised a hand or simply met his eyes and held them the acknowledgement of people gathered around the same understanding. He parked at the near end of the courthouse approach and called Danny. "We're here," he said, "all of us." "I know," Danny said. "I can see you from the window." A pause. Selena saw the street when she arrived. She didn't say anything, but she smiled. Marcus went inside to find Harold. Harold was in a small waiting area outside the courtroom with Danny and Rita sitting in one of the upholstered chairs that government buildings everywhere seemed to purchase from the same dispiriting catalog. He was wearing a suit, a dark blue suit that Marcus recognized from photographs in the trailer, the one Harold had worn to his wife's funeral, the one that fits slightly differently now than it had then, but that he had clearly pressed and prepared carefully. His Korean War service pin was on the lapel. His hair was combed. He looked, Marcus thought, like a man who had decided that this day mattered enough to dress for. Harold saw Marcus come in, and his face did several things at once, relief and steadiness, and a trace of the fear that never entirely left, and beneath all of it, something newer. Something that had been building since the Friday night of the storm, and Harold's 47 minutes of truth, and the moment he'd said yes to the recording light. Something that looked, Marcus thought, like a person who had decided they deserved to take up space. "How are you doing?" Marcus asked. "I've been worse," Harold said. "You have," Marcus agreed. "You definitely have." Rita was watching Harold with the attentive quietness she'd learned was more useful than reassurance. Danny had his case folder on his knees and the look of a man who had reviewed his preparations so many times it had become part of his breathing. "Is there anything you need before we go in?" Marcus asked. Harold thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "I'd like to go outside, just for a minute, before it starts." Marcus looked at him. "Yeah, I'd like some air." They went out the main entrance together. Marcus, Harold, Tom, Rita, Danny, and Harold stepped through the doors and stopped. He stood at the top of the courthouse steps and looked at the street, at the 2 blocks of motorcycles, at the 395 people standing beside them in their leather and their patches and their scarred hands and their particular kind of stillness that was different from absence. It was presence, chosen deliberately, presence as a statement, the way soldiers stand at attention, not because it's comfortable, but because the moment calls for it. Harold stood at the top of the steps and looked at all of it, and Marcus watched Harold's face. He had expected Harold to be moved. He had expected something visible, something emotional, the reasonable response of a man confronted with an extraordinary act of solidarity. What he had not expected was what actually happened, which was that Harold stood very straight and very still and looked at the assembled crowd, and then slowly every single one of them who caught his eye one by one began removing their helmets. It started at the nearest row and moved outward, a ripple, unhurried, unstoppable. Helmets off, heads bared, the November air on their faces in the early morning light. And then the veterans among them, and there were many, came to attention, not a shouted command, not a coordinated signal. Just the natural muscle memory response of people who had once been told that the way you honored something was to stand up straight and take off your hat and be present for it. 395 people saluted Harold Bennett. Harold looked at all of it for a long time. And then Marcus, standing beside him, heard the sound that Harold made, not quite a word, not quite a cry, something in between, the sound of something very old and very heavy, finally and completely releasing its hold. Harold's hand came up to his face. His shoulders moved once. Tom was immediately at his other side, not touching, not speaking, just there, big and solid and entirely certain that this was exactly where he was supposed to be. Harold lowered his hand. His eyes were wet. He blinked once, twice, clearing them. Then Harold Bennett, 87 years old, Korean War veteran, last of his blood family, and first of another kind, drew himself up as straight as his body would allow. He squared his shoulders. He lifted his chin, and he saluted back. Not a perfect military salute. His arm was too old for that, his wrist still carrying what it carried. But it was real. It was his. It said everything it needed to say. The crowd was completely silent. Marcus had to look away for a moment. Tom's jaw was working on something that he was not going to let become a sound. Harold lowered his hand. "Okay," Harold said. His voice was rough and clear and absolutely steady. "Let's go inside." They went. Selena Torres was exactly what Harold needed and everything Ethan had never anticipated. She was 44 years old and unhurried in the way that certain kind of competent people are unhurried, not because they don't care about urgency, but because they understand that urgency is a tool and panic is a liability. She had reviewed everything Danny had given her, and she had gone further, pulling financial records through proper channels that revealed the full scope of what Ethan had done. The joint account, the redirected pension payments, the truck, the medical expenses charged and then pocketed, the gambling transactions that told the story of where the money had gone, in what quantities, over what timeline. 18 months of systematic theft, $42,000 in misdirected VA pension payments, the truck valued at $11,000, additional cash withdrawals and account manipulations that brought the total financial exploitation to just under $60,000. And underneath all of it, the physical abuse documented now by Rita's photographs, by the pharmacy records, by Harold's testimony, and the 47 minutes of recorded truth. Harold testified for 2 hours. He sat in the witness stand in his blue suit with his service pin on the lapel, and he told the truth the way he told it on the storm night, plainly, specifically, with dates and sequences, and the particular details that only someone who lived them could produce. He talked about the cigarettes. He talked about the kitchen counter. He talked about the bank statements he'd found under the mattress the moment that had started everything. The moment Ethan had come home and found him at the table and looked at him across the kitchen with that expression. He talked about the power of attorney, about signing papers he hadn't understood because the person asking him to sign had been the person he trusted most in the world, and because Harold had been tired and lonely and had wanted more than anything to believe that his grandson had come home to take care of him. "Did you believe he was taking care of you?" Selena asked. Harold looked at her for a moment. "I believed he needed me to believe that," Harold said. "There's a difference, see? I think I always knew the difference. He stopped. I just wasn't ready to live in it yet. The courtroom was quiet. Mr. Bennett, Selena said, in the 11 months of physical abuse you've described at any point, did the defendant express remorse, apologize, attempt to stop? Harold's jaw moved slightly. He would sometimes put bandages on afterward, Harold said. He would sometimes bring me food or sit with me for a while and talk about ordinary things as if it hadn't happened. A pause. Once about 6 months in, he said he was sorry. He said he had a problem and he was going to get help. And did he? No, Harold said. Did the abuse stop after he said that? No, Harold said. It got worse. Selena nodded. She looked at her notes for a moment, then back at Harold. Mr. Bennett, in your own words, why did you stay? Why didn't you report this sooner? Harold looked at his hands. He looked at them for a long moment, the way he looked at his arms on the storm night when he'd laid them on the table. Because I loved him, Harold said. I know how it sounds, given everything. But it's true, he was my daughter's boy. I held him when he was 3 days old. I taught him to ride a bike in the driveway of the Prescott house in '95 on a Saturday afternoon. He fell off 4 times and cried and got back up each time, and I remember thinking, his voice was very quiet now. I remember thinking he was the kind of kid who would get back up. He stopped, breathed. I kept waiting for that kid to come back, Harold said. I kept thinking that if I was patient enough, if I forgave enough times, if I held on long enough, he would find his way back to who he used to be. He looked up. He didn't. I understand now that he didn't. But that's why I stayed. That's why I didn't report it. Because I was hoping for something that wasn't there anymore. The silence in the courtroom was the kind that had weight. Selena said, "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. No further questions." Ethan's attorney was thorough and not unkind, but Harold had an answer for every question that was rooted so completely in specific documented fact that the cross-examination accomplished nothing except to make Harold's account more detailed and therefore more damaging. When Harold stepped down from the witness stand, he walked back to his seat beside Danny and sat down and folded his hands in his lap. And Marcus, watching from the gallery, could see the slight tremor in Harold's hands. Not weakness, not fear, but the aftermath of an enormous expenditure of self. The way your hands shake after you've lifted something very heavy for a very long time and finally set it down. Marcus wanted to reach across the railing. He stayed where he was. Harold didn't need him at that moment. Harold had done what he'd come to do, and he had done it completely, and he needed a moment to sit in what that felt like. The judge recessed for 2 hours. The crowd outside Marcus was told by someone who went out to check had not moved. 395 people standing in the November cold of Flagstaff, Arizona, patient and quiet and entirely unwilling to leave before the thing was finished. When the court reconvened, the judge took 40 minutes to go through the findings. The language was legal and procedural and moved through the specific charges with the methodical thoroughness of a process that existed for exactly this purpose. Elder abuse physical, guilty. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, guilty. Theft over $25,000, guilty. Forgery of a legal document, guilty. Fraud in connection with federal veterans benefits. Referred to federal authorities with recommendation for prosecution. Through it all, Ethan sat at the defense table with his hands folded and his face doing something that was neither the warmth of his practiced smile nor the coldness Marcus had seen in his eyes in Harold's kitchen. It was something more exposed than either. The expression of someone for whom the performance had finally been made irrelevant by events. Harold sat very straight. When it was over, when the gavel came down and the bailiff moved toward Ethan and Ethan stood and allowed his hands to be cuffed with the particular stillness of someone who had known on some level that this moment was coming, Harold looked straight ahead at the front of the courtroom. His chin was lifted. His hands were still in his lap, the trembling, gone now, replaced by something more fundamental and more lasting. Marcus leaned forward from the gallery. "Harold," he said quietly. Harold turned. His eyes were clear. "It's done," Marcus said. Harold looked at him, and Harold nodded a single deliberate nod, the kind that meant more than agreement. The kind that meant, yes, I know. I'm here. I'm standing. They walked out of the courthouse together into the November air. And as Harold appeared at the top of the steps, 395 Harley engines started. Not all at once in a wave, a building sequence that rolled from one end of the street to the other, each engine adding to the sound until the whole street was vibrating with it. Not revving, not celebrating loudly, just running. Steady and deep and constant the way a river sounds, the way something alive sounds when it means to keep going. Harold stood at the top of the steps and listened to it. His hand came up to his service pin on his lapel. He touched it once briefly, the way you touch something that matters. Then he looked at Marcus, and Marcus had no way to know what Harold was going to say because Harold's face in that moment was doing too many things at once, and Marcus had learned not to predict what Harold would do with the things he felt most deeply. Harold said, "I'd like to go to Prescott to visit Margaret when things settle a bit." "I know," Marcus said. "Tom's already working on it." Harold looked at Tom, who was standing to his left with his helmet under one arm and an expression that suggested the arrangements for the Prescott trip were considerably further along than working on it. "You already planned it," Harold said. "We may have already planned it," Tom confirmed. Harold looked between them. Then he looked at the street, at all of it, at the sound and the presence and the extraordinary improbable fact of 395 people who had driven from everywhere to stand on a sidewalk in the cold for a man they mostly hadn't met. "I don't understand," Harold said. "I know I've said that before, but I still don't understand why." Marcus looked at him. "Because you matter," Marcus said. "That's the whole answer. You matter. What was being done to you mattered, and you deserve to not face the end of it alone." Harold was quiet. Around them the engines ran on steady and deep, and the November sky over Flagstaff was that particular blue that comes after weather clears hard and clean, and very far up the kind of blue that has nothing to apologize for. "No one stands alone anymore," Marcus said. "That's not a slogan. That's what this is. Every person standing out there today, that's what they came to say." Harold looked at the street for a long time. His hand was still at his lapel, still touching the service pin. Then he lowered his hand. He straightened his jacket. He lifted his chin the way he always did when he had decided to carry something forward rather than set it down. "Well," Harold said, "tell them thank you. From me, tell every single one of them." "You can tell them yourself," Marcus said. "You have got time." Harold looked at him. And for the first time since Marcus had found him beside the burned-out shed on a scorching August afternoon, for the first time in all the Wednesdays, in the one Tuesday, in the storm Friday, in the 2 hours of testimony, and everything before and everything between, Harold Bennett laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a courtesy laugh, a real one, full and sudden and surprised out of him by something that felt in that moment very much like the beginning of something rather than the end. The engines ran on. The laugh didn't last long. Laughs like that rarely do the ones surprised out of you by something larger than you expected, but it lasted long enough. Long enough for Tom to hear it and glance at Marcus with an expression that said he had not been certain until that exact moment that Harold was capable of that sound. Long enough for Rita coming through the courthouse doors behind them to stop mid-step and take it in. Long enough for it to travel somehow into the air of that November street, mixing with the sound of 395 engines running steady. Harold recovered himself quickly. He cleared his throat, he adjusted his jacket, but the edges of it were still there around his eyes and the slight loosening of his jaw, the residue of something genuine. "Prescott," Harold said to one in particular, as though confirming something he'd decided. "Next Saturday," Tom said. "If that works." Harold looked at him. "You planned the whole thing." Rita made a casserole to bring. Joe already mapped the route. Danny's got folding chairs in case you want to sit a while. Harold stared at him. "Folding chairs," Harold repeated. "For the visit," Tom said, "at the cemetery, in case you want to sit with her for a while and not be standing the whole time." Harold was quiet for a moment. His hand went back to his service pin. "Margaret would have liked you," Harold said finally. Tom's expression shifted very slightly. "That means something," he said. "I meant it to," Harold said. They helped him down the courthouse steps, and Marcus walked beside him into the street, and the people lining both sides saw him coming, and the engines didn't rev, didn't shout, didn't perform. They simply ran constant and present the way they had since the moment Harold had appeared at the top of the steps. Harold walked between the rows of motorcycles slowly the way he walked most things now, and he looked at faces as he went. He looked at strangers who had driven hours to stand on a sidewalk in the cold for him. He looked at veterans who had never met him and had come anyway because the call had described something that needed answering. He looked at young riders and old ones, men and women people, who carried their history on their skin in patches and ink. Some of them said things as he passed, not speeches, single words or short phrases. Thank you for your service. We've got you, sir. Welcome home. That last one, an old man in a Vietnam-era patch, said it quietly as Harold passed him, and Harold stopped walking for a moment. He looked at the man. You too, Harold said. The man's jaw moved. He nodded once. Harold kept walking. When he reached Marcus's truck, Harold stopped and turned around and looked back at the full length of what had assembled itself for him. He stood there taking it in with those pale blue eyes that had seen so much and held so much and were holding this now, all of it with a steadiness that had been rebuilt one Wednesday at a time over 13 weeks. I want to say something, Harold said. Marcus looked at him. To all of them? If that's possible. Marcus put two fingers to his mouth and whistled the particular sharp carrying sound that cut through engine noise and made a single gesture. The message passed through the crowd the way messages do among people who pay attention. The engines one by one cut to silence. It happened in under a minute. 395 motorcycles quiet. Harold stood in the sudden stillness, and he looked at all of them, and he said loudly enough to carry but without theatrics in the straightforward voice of a man who had spent 87 years on Earth and had just reclaimed the last part of himself he'd been willing to give away. I spent 60 years thinking nobody needed to hear from me anymore, that my time was past and my voice was used up and the only thing left to do was wait quietly. He paused. I was wrong about that. I know that now. Another pause, and this one had weight. You showed me something today. You showed me that being worth fighting for doesn't end when you get old, that the people you belong to don't have to share your blood, that sometimes, he stopped, steadied himself. Sometimes the family that chooses you is the only one that can save you. The street was completely silent. Harold put his hand to his service pin one final time. Then he lowered it. Thank you, he said. Every one of you. Thank you. Nobody cheered. Nobody engine revved or shouted. The crowd responded the way it had responded all morning, with presence, with attention, with the particular eloquence of people who understood that silence done right said more than noise. Then one by one helmets went back on, engines started, and 395 motorcycles turned themselves toward the highway and the long road home. And they went, not with drama, not with show, but with the quiet certainty of people who had done the thing they came to do. The drive to Prescott the following Saturday took a little under 2 hours. Tom drove Harold in Tom's truck, which was large and comfortable, and had heated seats that Harold appreciated without commenting on. Marcus rode alongside. Rita and Joe came in Joe's truck. Danny brought his wife, who had heard the story in pieces over 3 weeks and had asked quietly whether she could come, and Danny had said of course. They got there at mid-morning. The cemetery was small and well kept on a hillside outside the city where the Ponderosa Pines started. Harold directed Tom through the gates and along the path from memory. He knew exactly where she was. Every turn, every landmark, without needing to look at markers. 7 years without a visit, and he still knew. He was out of the truck before it fully stopped. He walked ahead of the group, and they let him go, staying back at a natural distance, the folding chairs still undeployed. When Harold reached the headstone, he stopped. He stood there for a long moment with his hands at his sides. Then he reached out and put one hand flat on the top of the headstone the way you put your hand on the shoulder of someone sitting down. Steady, present, the touch of someone arriving somewhere they have been trying to get back to. Marcus watched from a respectful distance. He watched Harold's shoulders move once, a single slow breath, and then settle. He watched Harold's lips move slightly, saying something private, something that was between Harold and Margaret and the Ponderosa Pines and nobody else. He watched Harold's posture change gradually over the next few minutes, not collapsing, not breaking, but softening in the way that old grief softens when it finally gets what it needs. The held-tight quality releasing incrementally, the jaw unclenching, the space around Harold's eyes going quieter. They were there for 2 hours. Joe set up the folding chairs, eventually quietly at a slight remove. Harold sat in one. Rita sat beside him. They talked sometimes about Margaret, about things Harold remembered, things he wanted to tell someone who hadn't heard them. A trip they'd taken to the Pacific coast in 1987. The way she made pie crust from scratch every Thanksgiving and refused to write down the recipe because she said recipes made people stop paying attention. The time she'd told Harold, in the second year of their marriage, that she wasn't going to be a woman who disappeared into someone else's life. And Harold had said good because he wanted a life with her in it, not behind it. And Margaret had looked at him with an expression he spent the next 35 years trying to deserve. She sounds like she was something, Rita said. She was everything, Harold said. She was my whole orientation. You know how some people are. You always know which direction they are, even when you can't see them. That's how she was for me. He looked at the headstone. 7 years and I still know which direction she is. Rita said nothing. She just sat beside him in the folding chair and let him have that. Later, Tom walked over and sat in the grass nearby. Just present, the way Tom was present, with his massive frame folded comfortably and his face relaxed and easy. At some point, Harold started talking about Korea again. Not the cold this time, not the hill that changed hands. Something earlier, basic training 1952, a sergeant who had been the most frightening person Harold had ever met until he encountered combat and discovered what frightening actually meant. How the sergeant had looked at Harold on the first day, skinny 19-year-old from a small Arizona town, and said, "You'll either be dead or dangerous. Haven't decided which yet." Tom laughed. Actually laughed, not the managed small smile he produced most of the time, but something real. Harold looked at him, and something lit up briefly in Harold's face, the satisfaction of making someone that particular kind of laugh. "Sergeant Briggs," Harold said. "He made it home. I heard he became a school teacher in Indiana. 3rd grade. Harold shook his head. 3rd grade. Terrifying children about phonics instead of combat. Different application of the same skill set. Tom laughed again. Marcus, listening from where he stood, thought, there it is. That's what it looks like. That's what it was supposed to look like all along. And it got buried under 11 months of cigarettes and fear and a grandson who needed Harold afraid because afraid was easier to control. When they finally gathered to leave, Harold stood at the headstone a long, final moment. He said something private. He put his hand on the stone again briefly. Then he stepped back and turned to face the group that had arranged itself at a respectful distance, waiting on him. Patient and present, leather and flannel, and a casserole in the back of Joe's truck. He looked at them for a moment. "She approves," Harold said. "I can always tell." The Veterans Assisted Living Facility was called Pineview, and it sat on the northern edge of Flagstaff in the particular way that good care facilities sometimes occupy good spaces, not institutional, not sterile, with actual trees and a garden that residents could access, and a staff that used names and remembered things. Danny had found it. Rita had visited it first alone to assess it with the critical eye of a medical professional and had reported back with a single word, good, which from Rita was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Harold moved in on the 1st of December, 5 weeks after the hearing. I didn't have much. The trailer had been leased, and the lease was ending anyway, and most of what Harold owned that mattered had been reduced over 14 months by Ethan's needs and Ethan's habits. But there were things, the photographs Harold and Margaret at various ages. Harold in uniform, a small boy who must have been Harold's daughter's child from before the boy became someone else. Margaret's curtains, which Harold had taken down carefully and folded and brought because he wasn't ready not to have them somewhere. His Korean War service photographs kept in a box that had somehow survived everything. A coffee mug with a faded print on it that Harold never explained and that Marcus never asked about. Tom carried boxes. Joe assembled the bed frame because Harold's facility room came with a frame that required assembly, and Joe treated this as a personal calling. Rita supervised where things went with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, and Harold directed from the doorway, saying left or no, the other left, not there, and the room became gradually and through collective effort a space that felt like it belonged to Harold rather than to the facility. When everyone had gone and Harold was alone in the room for the first time, he sat in the chair by the window, his chair brought from the trailer, the same faded lawn chair somehow still functional, and he looked at Margaret's curtains, which Rita had hung on the window before she left, and he sat with the particular quality of silence that was different from the silence of the trailer. Not the silence of isolation, not the silence of being alone and knowing no one was coming. The silence of a man who was resting, genuinely resting, for the first time in a very long while. I was still sitting there when his neighbor knocked on the door. A man about Harold's age, Korean War era, by the look of him, who introduced himself as Walter and said he'd heard Harold was a veteran and wanted to say welcome. Harold said thank you, and they talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular, and Harold found himself unexpectedly enjoying the conversation with the straightforward pleasure of someone who had forgotten that conversations could simply be that. When Walter left, Harold sat back in his chair and thought about that. The Wednesdays continued. Not out of obligation, the original purpose had been met, the original crisis resolved, the immediate danger removed, and the legal process grinding forward toward its conclusion. There was no practical reason to keep coming, and they kept coming anyway. Marcus showed up every Wednesday at noon. Sometimes Tom came, sometimes Danny, sometimes Rita, sometimes at a rotating cast of writers who had heard Harold's name and wanted to put a face to it. Harold started expecting them the way he'd learned to expect Wednesday itself as a fixed point in the week's architecture, reliable as weather patterns. They barbecued in the Pineview courtyard when the season allowed, hauling a portable grill that Joe had modified slightly for the purpose, and that the facility staff had approved with a kind of delighted surprise at being asked. Other residents filtered into the courtyard on barbecue days, drawn by the smell and the sound and the presence of people who took up space cheerfully. Harold introduced Marcus to Walter, who turned out to have opinions about motorcycle mechanics that were both strong and specific. Marcus introduced Walter to Danny. Danny and Walter discovered a shared history with a particular stretch of Korean terrain and spent an afternoon going over it in detail that excluded everyone else and included neither of them finding it lonely. Harold watched all of this with a quality of attention that Marcus noticed, a quiet, pleased attentiveness, the look of a man watching something grow that he had a hand in planting. On Harold's 88th birthday, the courtyard at Pineview contained 47 people, which was more people than the courtyard had ever contained simultaneously, in which the staff handled with the cheerful improvisation of people who had learned to be flexible. There were riders from 4 different chapters. 3 of Harold's new neighbors at Pineview, Walter's daughter, who had driven from Phoenix when Walter called and said she should come, a nurse named Carla, who had been Harold's primary care contact since he moved in, and who had arrived at the party in street clothes on her day off because she wanted to. Tom had made blueberry pancakes, not as a birthday cake substitute. There was also an actual cake, a chocolate one that Rita had commissioned from a bakery with Harold's name on it in blue frosting, but as a separate thing because Harold had mentioned once that Ethan's favorite childhood breakfast had been blueberry pancakes, and Tom had decided that the correct response to that information was to give Harold back the good version of the memory. Harold had looked at the pancakes when Tom set them down and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "He really did love these." "I know," Tom said. "I know you know," Harold said. "That's why you made them." Tom shrugged slightly. Memory belongs to the person who lived it, doesn't have to belong to what came after. Harold looked at him. "You're smarter than you look," Harold said. "Most people are," Tom said. Harold laughed. He picked up a fork and ate a pancake, and it was the best one he'd ever had, which was not necessarily about the recipe. Marcus sat beside Harold at some point in the afternoon when the party had reached the comfortable middle stage where people were talking in clusters, and the noise level was the good kind of noise, the kind that meant everyone was present and engaged and not performing anything. 88, Marcus said. "Don't remind me," Harold said. "You look good for it." "I look exactly like what 88 looks like," Harold said. "Don't be diplomatic." Marcus smiled. He looked at the courtyard, at the full, loud, improbable gathering of it. "What do you think when you look at all of this?" Harold considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think I almost missed it," Harold said. "That's what I think. I almost stayed in that trailer and kept quiet and missed all of it." He picked up his coffee mug, the one with the faded print that he'd never explained. "I spent a long time believing that asking for help meant admitting you couldn't manage. My generation, we didn't ask. You managed or you didn't, and you didn't talk about which." He shook his head. "I was wrong about that too. I've been wrong about a lot of things that I was very certain about." "What changed?" Marcus asked. Harold looked at him directly. "You knocked on a door I'd stopped expecting anyone to knock on," Harold said. "You didn't wait for me to open it. You just stayed outside it, long enough that I remembered the door was there." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Harold," he said, "can I ask you something? You're going to anyway. Do you regret it? Not the reporting, not the legal part, the trusting, letting us in, the whole thing." Harold thought about it for a longer moment than Marcus expected. "There was a period," Harold said, "around week 3 or 4 of your visits, when Ethan noticed the bikes coming around and started asking questions, And I started thinking, I've made a mistake. I've opened something I can't close again. I've put this in motion and now it's going to run wherever it runs and I don't control it anymore. He held his coffee mug. That was the most frightened I'd been in the whole thing. Not of him, of having chosen something. What got you through that? Marcus asked. Harold was quiet for a moment. You came back the next Wednesday, Harold said simply, and the one after that. And eventually I understood I don't know exactly when that you were going to keep coming back. That it wasn't conditional on anything I did or said or decided. You were just there, he looked at his mug. I'd forgotten that was something people could be. The party continued around them. Tom was teaching Walter's daughter something about the engine of a particular motorcycle model, and she was listening with more interest than he'd apparently expected, which was making Tom visibly pleased. Rita was talking to Carla, the nurse, about something medical that had made them both laugh. Danny's wife was helping two of the Pineview residents figure out a phone problem that was apparently significant and complicated. Joe was doing what Joe did at gatherings, which was occupying himself with the logistical infrastructure, making sure everyone had food, that chairs were available, that the grill was properly supervised. Harold watched all of it. I spent my whole life believing family had to share my blood, Harold said. He said it the way he'd said things on the storm night, not performing, not addressing anyone, just finding the words that fit the thing he was trying to say. My wife, my daughter, my grandson. That was the shape of it. That was what I understood it to mean. He looked across the courtyard at the leather vests and the faces he'd come to know one Wednesday at a time. Turns out I had the definition wrong. What's the right definition? Marcus asked. Harold was quiet for a moment. He took a sip of his coffee. He set the mug down carefully. Family is the people who refuse to leave, Harold said. That's all it is. The people who stay when staying is inconvenient, who come back when coming back isn't required, who knock on doors that don't open easily and wait outside them without making it the door's fault. He looked at Marcus. Blood is just biology. He gestured at the courtyard, at all of it. This is a choice. Every single one of them chose to be here. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. Marcus looked at him. You should have been a writer, Marcus said. I should have been a lot of things, Harold said. I'm 88. I'm working with what I've got. 3 months later, Ethan Bennett was sentenced to 6 years in the Arizona State Correctional System on the state charges. The federal wire fraud charge added an additional 18 months to run consecutively. His assets, what remained of them after the gambling had done its work, were seized and applied toward restitution. The restitution wouldn't cover everything. It never did. But it covered enough to fund Harold's care at Pineview for the next several years, which was a justice that had the particular quality of the practical. Harold was told about the sentence on a Wednesday by Danny in the Pineview common room. He listened to all of it without interruption. When Danny finished, Harold nodded. Okay, Harold said. Danny waited. That's it, Danny asked. Harold thought about it. I don't know what else there is to say, Harold said. It's done. The right thing happened. I wish he stopped. I wish he had been someone different. I wish whatever broke in him had broken differently or not at all. I wish the boy I taught to ride a bike in the Prescott driveway had stayed closer to the surface. He looked at his hands. But wishing doesn't change what happened. And what happened is that a court of law looked at everything and came to the right conclusion. That's not nothing. After a year of thinking nobody would believe me if I said anything, that's actually quite a lot. Danny looked at him. You okay, Harold? Harold met his eyes. Yes, Harold said. I am genuinely okay. I know how that sounds given everything. But he stopped, tried to find the right way to say it. The feeling I have right now is not what I expected. I expected relief, or something I don't know sadder than this. But what I feel is something closer to clean. Like when you wash something that's been dirty for a long time, and it finally comes out the way it was always supposed to look. Danny was quiet for a moment. Good, he said finally. That's Harold, that's the right feeling to have. Marcus came for the Wednesday visit an hour later and found Harold in the courtyard with Walter, the two of them arguing cheerfully about some baseball statistic that neither of them seemed to have clear data on, but both of them had strong opinions about. Harold waved him over. Marcus sat down. He was immediately conscripted into the argument on Harold's side, which he attempted by acknowledging immediately that he didn't follow baseball well enough to have standing. Harold said that didn't matter. He agreed with Marcus anyway, And Walter said that was the problem with the youth of today, which made Marcus laugh because the last time anyone had referred to him as youth was so far in the past he couldn't locate it. They sat in the courtyard for 3 hours. Other residents came and went. Staff people passed through and stopped briefly and moved on. Tom arrived at some point with a bag of food from a place he'd decided Harold needed to try. And Harold tried it, and the argument about baseball was eventually resolved in the way most such arguments are resolved, which is that everyone held their position and decided it didn't matter and moved on to the next thing. When the afternoon was ending and Marcus was getting ready to go, Harold walked him to the facility entrance, the way he always did now, out through the main door to the edge of the parking area where Marcus's bike was parked. Harold looked at the bike for a moment. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Harold said. "What?" "That afternoon last August, that veterans ride. The way I was sitting in that lawn chair by the burned-out shed, and you pulled up on that bike and walked over and crouched down in the dirt to be at eye level with me." Harold shook his head slightly. "I almost told you nothing. I almost said I was fine and let you go. I had the words ready. I'd said them to everyone else." "Why didn't you?" Marcus asked. Harold looked at him. "Because you crouched down," Harold said. "That's all. Everyone else had walked past or stayed standing or just glanced at me and kept going. But you crouched down to be level with me, like I was worth being level with." He was quiet for a moment. "Nobody had done that in a long time. It disarmed me. Before I knew what was happening, you'd lifted that sleeve and there it was." Marcus said nothing. "I've thought about that a lot," Harold continued, "about how much hangs on the small things, how a life can change because someone decided to crouch down instead of stand over." He looked at Marcus steadily. "You didn't know what you were starting. You just did the thing that seemed right." "That's all it ever is," Marcus said, "usually." Harold put his hand out. Marcus shook it. Harold's grip was firmer than it had any right to be at 8, and it held for a moment longer than a casual handshake. And Marcus understood it for what it was. The grip of a man saying something that was bigger than any specific words currently available. "Wednesday," Harold said. "Wednesday," Marcus said. Harold turned and walked back through the facility entrance, back to the warmth and the noise and the people who called him by name, and remembered how he took his coffee and knocked on his door to ask if he wanted to join the Tuesday game and saved him the chair by the window in the common room, because they'd noticed that was the one he preferred. Marcus stood at his bike for a moment. He looked at the entrance Harold had disappeared through. He thought about 13 weeks of Wednesdays, one storm, one recording, one courthouse, one November street, filled with 395 engines running steady. I thought about a frail old man in a lawn chair with his sleeves buttoned to his wrists who had looked at Marcus crouching in the dirt beside him and made a calculation that had cost him everything he'd been protecting and given him back everything he'd lost. I thought about what courage actually looked like when you stripped away the performances of it, when it wasn't dramatic or loud or made for witnesses, when it was just an 87-year-old man lifting a sleeve in the August heat of Arizona and letting someone see. Marcus put on his helmet. He started his engine. He sat with the sound for a moment the way he always sat with it, the particular constant forward-pointing sound of a machine that knew what it was built for. Then he pulled out of the parking lot and onto the open road, and the Arizona sky was the specific and extraordinary blue that came after everything had cleared, and it went all the way to the horizon in every direction, and there was a long way still to ride, and every mile of it was exactly worth riding. Because somewhere in a courtyard in Flagstaff, an 88-year-old man was arguing baseball statistics with his neighbor and eating food from a bag Tom had brought, and wearing Margaret's curtains on his window and laughing, actually laughing, the real kind, the kind that had to be surprised out of him before he knew it was there. And that was not a small thing. That was not a small thing at all. Real strength was never measured by how frightening a man looked. It was measured by who he chose to stand beside when standing was hard. It was measured by a crouching down, a lifted sleeve, a Wednesday kept without being required. It was measured by 395 engines running steady on a cold November street. Not for show, not for noise, but for one specific reason, because a man who had survived a hill that changed hands 3 times in a week, and 37 years of marriage, and 11 months of burning deserved to walk into a courthouse, knowing that behind him, as far as he could see, there was not 1 inch of empty road. Harold Bennett had gone looking for family in all the places family was supposed to be, and had found it in the end exactly where he'd stopped looking, in the people who came back and kept coming back and refused every invitation the world extended to stop. That was the whole story. That was all of it, and it was enough. "Take your hands off of my employee." The three words came out quiet. No raised voice, no table slammed, just a 65-year-old man setting down a beer glass with the kind of stillness that made the entire bar go cold. Travis Kane turned around, looked at the old bartender standing behind the counter, and then did something that would cost him everything. He laughed. If you're watching this from your city, drop it in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and stay with me until the very last word. You won't want to walk away from this one. The heat that rolled off the Arizona desert on a Friday evening wasn't the kind you complained about. It was the kind you carried in your lungs, the kind that pressed against the back of your neck and stayed there like a hand that refused to lift. By 7 o'clock, the air outside the Dust Devil Roadhouse had already baked everything it touched into something dry and brittle. And the neon sign above the door buzzed and flickered the way it always did when the temperature climbed past 100 and the generator worked twice as hard to keep the beer cold. Ashley Monroe had been on her feet since noon. She hadn't eaten since breakfast. A half piece of toast she'd cut in two because Danny had wanted the other half, and she wasn't about to tell an 8-year-old that money was tight again. She'd pulled her blonde hair back before her shift with a rubber band she'd found at the bottom of her purse, and by 7 that evening, half of it had slipped free and hung against the side of her face in the kind of way that made her look younger than 24, more exhausted than she wanted anyone to notice. She loaded a tray with 4 long neck bottles and carried them to the corner booth without spilling a drop. That was one thing about Ashley Monroe. Whatever else was falling apart in her life, her hands stayed steady. "You're a lifesaver," said the trucker in the window seat. Big man, work-roughened hands, a faded cap that read something agricultural across the front. "Just doing my job," she said, and she smiled the way she always smiled at customers. Not fake, not forced, but measured. Like she'd learned early that warmth was a resource, and you had to spend it carefully. The Dust Devil wasn't a beautiful bar. It had never pretended to be. The wooden floor had been warped and re-nailed so many times that certain boards sang underfoot if you hit them at the wrong angle. The pool table in the far corner leaned slightly to the left, a problem everyone had accepted so completely that regulars automatically compensated when they lined up their shots. The walls held a collection of mounted antlers, sun-bleached license plates, and photographs of the highway outside in every decade going back to the 1950s, when Silver Creek, Arizona was little more than a fuel stop with ambitions. But the Dust Devil had something that couldn't be nailed to a wall or poured into a glass. It had Jack. Jack Mercer stood behind his bar the way a man stands inside his own skin, completely without apology, without any apparent need for the world to rearrange itself on his behalf. He was 65 years old and built like something carved rather than born, the kind of lean that comes not from deprivation, but from decades of use of physical life lived without excess or decoration. His hands were large and quiet. His gray hair was cut close. He had a face that had weathered everything the desert and the years could throw at it and come out looking not beaten, but settled the way stone looks after a river has run over it for long enough. I didn't talk much. He didn't need to. Ashley had been working the Dust Devil for 6 weeks, and she had already understood something about Jack Mercer that most people took months to figure out: that his silence was not emptiness. It was the opposite of emptiness. It was the kind of quiet that a person arrives at only after they have been through enough noise to last several lifetimes. She liked him. More than liked him. She trusted him, which was something she did not give easily, not after the last 2 years of her life. Her parents had died 14 months apart, her father from a cardiac event on a Tuesday morning with his boots still on her, mother from a grief that disguised itself as pneumonia 6 months after the funeral. Ashley had been 22 years old when the second casket went into the ground, standing in the cold in a black dress that didn't fit right, holding her 7-year-old brother's hand, and understanding with the particular clarity that loss produces that she was now all he had. Danny was 8 now. He was in 3rd grade. He liked dinosaurs with a focused encyclopedic passion that made Ashley secretly proud every time he corrected her on the difference between a brachiosaurus and an apatosaurus. He had their father's eyes and their mother's stubbornness, and Ashley had arranged her entire existence around keeping him fed, housed, and enrolled in the school where his teacher, Mrs. Calloway, had taken a particular interest in him. The Dust Devil paid $11 an hour plus tips. It was enough. Barely, but enough. And Jack had never once made her feel like she was lucky to have the job. He made her feel like the job was lucky to have her, which was a distinction that mattered more than she could easily explain. By 7:30, the bar had filled to its comfortable middle, not packed, not sparse. A table of ranchers near the window. A couple of bikers at the bar who'd been riding through and stopped for dinner. 3 men in their 50s playing a slow, deliberate game of pool and not talking much about anything. The television above the bar ran a baseball game with the sound low. Ashley was refilling the ranchers' water glasses when the door opened. She noticed it the way you notice a change in air pressure. Not loud, not dramatic, just different. Travis Kane walked in like a man who had recently decided he owned every room he entered and had not yet encountered enough resistance to question that conclusion. He was 31 years old, medium height, the kind of physically present that comes from hours in a gym and a vanity that required an audience. He had dark hair slicked back from his face and a jaw that looked like it had been set permanently in the direction of confrontation. Behind him came two men, Denny Pruitt and Carl Voss, both bigger than Travis in raw physical terms, both carrying themselves 2 careful steps behind him in the way that indicated he was in charge and they were glad not to be. Ashley had seen them before. 3 weeks ago, Travis Kane had come in on a Tuesday afternoon and asked to speak to the owner. Jack had come out from the back, dried his hands on a bar rag, and listened to 4 minutes of what Travis called a business proposition, and Jack called something else entirely, though he didn't say what. He'd told Travis no. He'd said it the same way he said most things, quietly, without aggression, without elaboration. Travis had smiled in a way that didn't reach any part of his face above his mouth and said, "Think it over, old man. We'll be back." Jack had gone back to what he was doing. He'd told Ashley afterward when she asked, "Don't worry about it." She had worried about it. Now Travis crossed the floor with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes finding Ashley before they found anything else in the room. That detail registered somewhere below her conscious mind that her face was what he looked for first, and it made the fine hairs on her arms rise slightly. "Where's the old man?" Travis said. His voice carried across the bar. Not loud, but deliberately pitched to travel. He wanted people to hear him. He wanted people to know he was not someone who lowered his voice in other people's spaces. "Mr. Mercer's in the back," Ashley said. "Can I help you with something?" "Yeah." Travis stopped 2 feet in front of her. "You can tell him Travis Kane is here to collect. I can let him know you'd like to speak with him." "I just said collect." Travis tilted his head slightly. "You know what that means, right? Collection. Money, the arrangement we made." "I'm not aware of any arrangement," Ashley said. Her voice came out steady. She was quietly grateful for that. Whatever her hands did or didn't do, she needed her voice to hold, and it did. "You're not aware," Travis repeated, and he looked back at Denny and Carl with an expression that performed amusement for their benefit. "She's not aware? That's funny." He turned back to her. "Go get the old man. Tell him this isn't optional anymore." Ashley set her tray down on the nearest table and walked to the back. Jack was in his office, a room barely large enough for a desk and a filing cabinet, doing what he did every Friday evening, going through the week's receipts, with a patience that suggested he genuinely found the task worthwhile. He looked up when Ashley appeared in the doorway. "Travis Kane," she said. "He's here to collect." Jack looked at her for a moment. "You okay?" "I'm fine. Jack, there are 3 of them." "There were 3 last time, too." Jack set his pen down. He pressed both palms against the desktop and pushed himself up. Not with difficulty, but with the deliberate economy of a man who didn't waste movement. "Go pour the Hendersons another round, on the house tonight." "Jack, go on." He walked out past her, and she stood for a moment in the doorway of his empty office, looking at the old steel locker in the corner. She didn't know what was in it. She had never asked. There was something about it, the way the combination lock was the only thing in the office that showed no dust, as though Jack touched it regularly even if he never opened it, that told her it was not a question to ask yet. She went and poured the Hendersons their beer. Jack walked to the bar. He stood behind the counter and looked at Travis Kane the way a man looks at weather he has seen before and knows how to wait out. "Mr. Kane," he said. "Jack." Travis moved to the bar and put both hands flat on the counter, leaning in as though proximity would accomplish what words hadn't managed yet. "I've been patient. I've been patient for 4 weeks and I'm done being patient. This isn't personal. Every place on this highway pays. You pay, we make sure nothing happens to your establishment. You don't pay, he spread his hands. Bad things happen in the desert. I heard you the first time, Jack said. The answer is still no. That's a mistake. Maybe. It's not a maybe. Travis pushed off the counter and straightened. The performance was slipping slightly, the smile tightening around the edges, the charm working harder than it should have needed to. You're a 65-year-old man running a bar in the middle of nowhere. You don't have the kind of friends who make problems go away. You're alone out here, Jack, and alone is dangerous. Order something or leave, Jack said. Either one is fine. The bar had gone quiet. Not the quiet of people who stopped caring. The quiet of people who had stopped pretending not to listen, who were sitting very still, because something in the air had shifted and they were trying to determine which direction was going to require them to move. Travis Kane heard it, he felt it, and something in him, that part of men like him that requires an audience and requires the audience to be impressed, decided it was time to change the nature of the conversation. He turned. He looked at Ashley. She was behind the bar refilling the Henderson's mugs, and she was doing it with the studied calm of someone who was very much aware of being looked at and very much determined not to show it. Her back was 3/4 turned to Travis. Her hands were steady. He walked toward her. She heard him coming before she saw him. The quality of the floor's silence changed when he crossed it, boots heavier, with intention. And she turned, keeping her expression neutral, keeping the mug in her hand, keeping her voice somewhere in the vicinity of steady, when she said, "Can I get you something?" Travis reached out and picked up the receipt pad from the bar beside her hand. He held it up, looked at it, set it back down. A demonstration of casual ownership. A way of touching her world without touching her, yet. "Pretty girl like you," he said, "working a place like this, that's a waste." "I like my job," Ashley said. "Jack paying you enough to make this worth it. That's between me and Mr. Mercer. Because I could pay you more." Travis was close now, closer than a conversation required, closer than anything except intent requires. There are better places to be than out here in the heat serving beer to men who leave dollar tips. "I said I like my job." "Yeah, you said that." Travis picked up her receipt pad again. This time he didn't put it back. He turned it over in his hands. "What's your name?" "Ashley." "Ashley." He said it like he was tasting it, deciding whether it suited him. "Here's the thing, Ashley, your boss has a problem, and his problem is about to become your problem. And I'd hate for a pretty girl who likes her job to end up in a bad situation because her old boss made a bad decision." "You should probably give that back," Ashley said, indicating the pad. Travis looked at her for a long moment. Then he threw the pad on the floor. The sound of it hitting the boards was small. Almost nothing, and it was somehow the loudest thing that had happened in the room all evening. Two of the ranchers shifted in their seats. The pool players had put their cues down. Ashley did not move to pick it up. She held Travis Kane's gaze with a steadiness she was borrowing from somewhere she could not name, from her father, maybe, who had never in her memory been the first to look away from a hard thing. "Pick it up," Travis said. "No," said Ashley. The word was quiet. It was also entirely without negotiation. Travis stared her. The expression on his face cycled through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, irritation, the specific male fury of a man who is accustomed to compliance and has just encountered its absence. And then he reached out and grabbed her by the hair. The scream that went through the bar